The world shrinks to the perimeter of a single, suffocating room in the deep watch of midnight. Outside, the city sleeps under a canopy of cold stars, indifferent to the quiet drama unfolding within the walls of a human habitation. Inside, a lone figure sits motionless upon the edge of a bed. The only illumination is the stark, pale blue glare of a glowing screen, a digital ledger displaying an unyielding, merciless truth, a bank balance dipping into the perilous depths of a deficit. In this heavy silence, the air itself feels dense, weighted with the invisible pressure of financial anxiety. Every tick of the wall clock echoes like a solemn hammer strike, marking the passage of time that demands payments, settlements, and survival. The physical body bears the unmistakable marks of this invisible war. The jaw is locked in a tight protective clench, the unconscious human defense mechanism against an environment that feels hostile. The shoulders are drawn tight, burdened by the heavy luggage of not enough, carrying the invisible strain of the daily hustle as if it were a physical cross. To the untrained eye, this is a scene of raw defeat. It is the moment where the human animal feels most trapped, isolated in a concrete reality governed by numbers, red ink, and the hard laws of cause and effect. The mind spins in a desperate, frantic loop of calculation, attempting to solve the equation of tomorrow, using the exhausted resources of yesterday. Then, the pattern interruption occurs. Suddenly, a profound shift alters the very architecture of perception. The wise, invisible observer looks past the immediate shadow of the room. The walls do not merely enclose space. They begin to soften, their material density giving way to a vast, silent infrastructure that belongs to the deeper realms of consciousness. The cold blue light of the screen loses its power to terrorize. A realization, majestic and authoritative, cuts through the static of human panic. This state of deep unrest is not a descent into tragedy. It is not an escape from a broken world, nor is it a helpless surrender to exhaustion. It is, in truth, the exact threshold of a sacred pilgrimage. The paradox of this midnight hour is revealed. The moment of greatest physical helplessness is the precise moment of supreme spiritual capability. As the physical body prepares to surrender its waking consciousness to the night, it is not merely closing its eyes to sleep. It is stepping across the boundary of the visible world into the divine workshop, a sanctuary completely beyond the reach of human doubt, an immutable space where the heavy chains of financial struggle are destined to be dissolved and rewritten in the timeless language of gold and light. To understand the mechanics of this transformation, human consciousness must be subjected to a rigorous psychological and philosophical deconstruction. The central question must be asked with uncompromising depth. Why does the human mind default to the frequency of scarcity when confronted by an empty ledger? And how does this internal assumption dictate the terms of physical reality? The answer lies in the profound misunderstanding of cause and effect that governs the waking day. The human mind, operating in the high-frequency static of the beta brainwave state, is entirely dependent upon the reports of the five physical senses. It looks at the empty bank account, hears the rumors of economic hardship, touches the unpaid bills, and concludes, "I am poor." This conclusion, however, is a catastrophic metaphysical error. It is the error of mistaking the shadow for the object that casts it. The physical world is not a fixed, independent entity that happens to an individual. It is a delayed reflection, an acoustic feedback loop of past internal assumptions. If a person stands before a physical mirror and dislikes the sorrowful expression on the face reflected there, they do not attempt to alter the mirror. They do not smash the glass or use physical force to reshape the silvered surface. They understand that the reflection is entirely helpless. It can only mirror the state of the object standing before it. To change the reflection, one must change the internal state of the features. Yet, in the realm of finance, humanity spends its entire existence attempting to manipulate the mirror. The hustle, the breathless, anxious struggle to force money into manifestation through sheer physical labor is an attempt to alter the reflection while leaving the internal countenance unchanged. This is where the metaphor of the radio dial becomes essential. Human consciousness operates as a highly sophisticated receiver. The universe is a vast, shimmering ocean of formless energy, containing all frequencies simultaneously: the frequency of wealth, the frequency of poverty, the frequency of health, and the frequency of disease. They all exist in the same space at the same time, completely independent of one another. When the mind dwells upon the lack of money, when it speaks of its debts, and when it winces at the price tag of life, it has tuned its internal radio dial to the station of famine. The universe, acting as a non-judgmental amplifier, has no choice but to broadcast the clear, uninterrupted sound of scarcity back into the individual's life. The environment becomes the echo of the internal sound. How, then, does one shift the dial from the frequency of wanting to the frequency of having? It cannot be achieved through the frantic energy of the logical mind. The logical mind is bound to the porch of the five senses. It can only report on what is currently visible. For true reprogramming to occur, the vessel must become perfectly still. The analytical sentry must be put to sleep. When the body enters the deep, relaxed states of theta and delta, the critical mind steps down from its guard post. The walls between the individual and the infinite substance become as thin as a veil of silk. In this twilight state, the mind ceases to be a reporter of facts and becomes a legislator of reality. It stops begging for a portion of wealth from an external source and begins to speak with the quiet, unshakable authority of an heir reclaiming an inheritance. The realization dawns that wealth and the self are fundamentally one and the same. The gold is not outside the soul. It is the very fabric from which the soul is woven. To illustrate this timeless principle in action, one must look to the historical legacy of an ancient city named Oros, which flourished in the early centuries of a forgotten epoch. At the exact geographical center of this city stood a magnificent architectural masterpiece known as the Spire of Plenitude. It was a tower of incredible proportions, carved from an unknown luminescent stone that naturally caught the golden rays of the sun and cast a warm, radiant glow over every street, marketplace, and home. For generations, the citizens of Oros lived in total abundance. Their fields were perpetually fertile, their trade routes were safe, and their treasuries were overflowing. However, a great historical shift occurred. A neighboring empire, driven by a philosophy of extreme caution and fear, brought word of a coming century of famine. The rulers of Oros, infected by this viral narrative of shortage, panicked. In a misguided effort to protect the Spire of Plenitude from the eyes of envious rivals, they ordered the monument to be covered. Massive, heavy sheets of rough gray canvas, damp, tattered, and ill-fitting, were woven from the fibers of coarse mountain plants. Teams of workers labored for months, wrapping the luminescent spire in layer upon layer of this dark, heavy cloth, binding it tight with thick iron chains until the tower resembled nothing more than a jagged, ominous monolith of gray stone. As the generations passed, a strange psychological phenomenon took root in Oros. The citizens who had witnessed the uncovered spire died out. Their children, and their children's children, grew up seeing only the gray, tattered canvas shroud. The memory of the golden light beneath the cloth faded into myth. The people began to believe that the rough, abrasive texture of the canvas was the actual substance of the tower. They treated the monument with fear, writing songs about the great gray burden at the center of their city. Believing their source of light was dead, the economy of Oros collapsed into a state of permanent survival. The people became cautious, clenching their coins, fighting over crumbs in the marketplace, and living under a permanent veil of poverty consciousness. One day, a quiet scholar named Kalen ascended the steps of the monument's foundation. Kalen had spent decades studying the ancient pre-famine scrolls and knew the true design of the architecture. He did not carry tools of demolition. He did not bring an army to hack at the iron chains with swords. He simply walked to the base of the tower in the silence of the dawn, when the rest of the city was caught in the deep paralysis of sleep. Kalen reached out his hand and touched the rough canvas. He did not curse the cloth. He did not weep over its ugliness. Instead, he spoke to the structure beneath it. Using a voice rooted in absolute, calm authority, he chanted the true description of the tower as recorded in the ancient texts. He called the spire by its true name, the luminescent gold. As the words vibrated through the morning air, a spectacular sight unfolded. The vibration of the spoken truth resonated with the hidden stone beneath the shroud. The golden light inside the tower began to pulse, growing brighter and warmer with every steady breath Kalen took. The heat of the underlying gold became so intense that the damp, tattered canvas began to smoke. One by one, the iron chains snapped, unable to contain the thermal expansion of the radiant energy. The gray sheets dissolved into ash, carried away by the morning wind, until the spire of plenitude stood once more in its original unrestricted majesty, bathing the city of Oros in an avalanche of gold and light. The citizens woke to find their world completely transformed, realizing that the poverty they had endured for a century was never a fact of their geography. It was merely a temporary veil they had mistaken for reality. The lesson of Oros is the exact lesson the traveler must integrate as they prepare to surrender to the night. The tattered garments of limitation, the jagged fears of scarcity, and the deep-seated whispers of unworthiness that have been handed down through generations are not part of the soul's true identity. They are merely the rough canvas sheets wrapped around a golden blueprint that has stood the test of centuries. To apply this truth today, the individual must undergo an immediate cessation of all financial reporting. One must make a sovereign decree to stop describing the canvas. To speak of one's lack, to complain about the rising cost of existence, or to worry over the mechanical how of future supply, is simply to stitch new patches onto the shroud of scarcity. Tonight, as the body sinks into the mattress, the traveler is instructed to consciously feel the gravity of grace pressing into the bed beneath them. This is the moment to let the jaw go slack to release the physical site where financial stress is hoarded. Let the forehead become as smooth and wide as the surface of a still lake at midnight. Imagine the frantic numbers, the urgent emails, and the voices of the day as a swarm of bees flying further and further away into the distance until the air is perfectly silent. Move the awareness to the throat, the literal seat of the word, the location where the sovereign wand is kept. Visualize a steady golden light forming at the base of the neck, growing brighter with every deep, unhurried breath. In the sanctuary of the inner mind, let the traveler repeat these words of power. I cast every burden of lack into the sea of nothingness. I am free to receive. I am open to have. I am a match for the opulence of the universe. The work of the initial alignment is now secure. The conscious mind has agreed to drop its weapons, and the old ledger has begun to thin into mist. But the journey has only just begun. As the consciousness drifts past the final gates of waking logic, it leaves behind the noisy front porch of the mind and begins its descent into a far vast and silent architecture. The heavy oak doors of the deeper chambers are about to swing wide upon their hinges. The traveler must now prepare to walk through the halls of the inner mansion, where the laws of man no longer apply, and where the specific frequencies of absolute supply are waiting to be navigated, claimed, and brought into the light of day. The atmosphere shifts from the isolated stillness of the midnight bedroom to a vast, chaotic theater of human struggle. An invisible observer looks down upon a sweeping, exposed wooden porch that clings to the side of a colossal mountain fortress. A violent summer storm rages across the landscape. The sky is a roiling canvas of bruised purples and charcoal grays, torn apart by jagged spikes of lightning that illuminate the sheets of driving, freezing rain. The wind howls with a feral intensity, whipping across the slippery wooden planks of the porch with the force of an unseen engine. On this exposed platform, a dense crowd of human beings is packed together in a state of hyper-vigilant panic. They are drenched to the bone, shivering violently under the assault of the elements. Their hands are raw, bleeding and trembling as they frantically clutch wet, tearing pieces of paper currency and small, tarnished copper pennies. These coins slip through their frozen fingers, clattering into the gaps between the floorboards and vanishing into the abyss below. The crowd screams into the gale, throwing their voices against the thunderclaps, begging the sky to alter its course, and attempting to bargain with the wind for a moment of shelter or a scattering of gold. They believe with an absolute terrifying conviction that their survival depends entirely upon their ability to withstand the fury of the storm and out-hustle the downpour. Now, look closer at the profound paradox that defines this scene. Directly behind this screaming, panicked multitude stands a magnificent structure of impenetrable stone, the grand facade of an endless mansion that stretches deep into the heart of the mountain. Its towering oak doors, reinforced with untarnished bronze bindings, remain perfectly stationary, insulated from the vibration of the tempest. Inside that mansion lies an absolute sanctuary. Endless galleries of quiet warmth, deep hearths burning with eternal fires, and vast vaults filled with uncoined gold and inexhaustible supply. The key to these doors is not hidden in some distant land. It is a native birthright woven into the very fabric of human consciousness. Yet, not a single individual in the crowd turns around to look at the entrance. They remain completely mesmerized by the violence of the external world, trapped in the illusion that they must fight the environment to live, while the gateway to infinite wealth stands completely ignored just an inch behind their backs. To comprehend why humanity remains paralyzed upon the wet planks of this psychological porch, one must initiate a rigorous philosophical and psychological deconstruction of human consciousness. The wise observer must ask the foundational question: why does the human creature default to fighting the external storm of scarcity? And how does the internal navigation of the mind's architectural frequencies dictate the physical appearance of wealth? The answer to this query requires a deep exploration of the relationship between human brainwave frequencies and the material world. The frantic crowd upon the porch is operating entirely within the high-frequency parameters of the beta brainwave state. This is the domain of the five physical senses, the realm of hypervigilance, analytical calculation, and survival. In the beta state, the mind behaves like a primitive radar system, constantly scanning the horizon for economic threats, counting the diminishing resources, and reacting to the reports of the marketplace. Why does the mind remain trapped here? Because humanity has been conditioned through centuries of collective fear to believe that the physical world is the sovereign object, and the inner mind is merely its passive shadow. This conditioning is a catastrophic reversal of metaphysical truth. The physical environment is never a primary cause. It is a delayed reflection, an acoustic feedback loop of past internal assumptions. To understand this, consider the metaphor of the mirror. If a person stands before a physical mirror and observes a sorrowful, impoverished expression upon the face reflected within the glass, they do not attempt to alter the mirror itself. They do not smash the glass. Nor do they employ physical force to manually reshape the silvered surface into a smile. They recognize that the reflection is entirely helpless, lacking any independent substance or volitional power. It can only mirror the exact lineaments of the object standing before it. To transform the reflection, the individual must alter the internal state of their own features. Yet, in the theater of financial survival, humanity spends its entire existence attempting to manipulate the mirror. The relentless hustle, the breathless, anxious, muscular struggle to force money into manifestation through sheer physical friction is an evolutionary error. It is a desperate attempt to reshape the reflection while leaving the internal countenance of poverty completely intact. This brings the deconstruction to the mechanics of the radio dial. The universe is not a rigid structure of fixed limitations. It is a vast, shimmering ocean of formless energy, vibrating at every conceivable frequency simultaneously. The frequency of absolute opulence and the frequency of desperate famine occupy the exact same space at the exact same moment. They are entirely independent realities. When an individual remains stranded upon the porch of beta consciousness, their internal radio dial is locked into the station of emergency. Every thought of lack, every utterance of financial worry, and every wince of anxiety at the arrival of an expense acts as a powerful transmitter. Because the universe functions as an infinite amplifier, it has no choice but to broadcast the clear, uninterrupted sound of scarcity back into the individual's life. The external environment becomes the echo of the internal sound wave. How then does the traveler step away from the frozen planks of the porch and enter the treasury of the mansion? The transition cannot be achieved through the frantic energy of the logical mind, for logic is a creature of the porch. It can only calculate based upon what is already visible in the storm. The mind must intentionally slow its internal vibration, passing through the massive bronze doors into the grand corridor known as the alpha state. In the hall of alpha, the frantic analytical engine begins to lose its grip. The sharp, jagged edges of physical data, the terrifying bank statements, the economic forecasts, the memories of past failures begin to blur and soften. The cold, unyielding logic that declared a financial situation impossible starts to lose its authority. Here, in the gentle evening light of alpha, the lantern of the imagination is finally permitted to glow with a warm, golden illumination. The soul ceases to be a passive observer of the storm and begins to realize its position as the master architect of the entire estate. The mind is prepared to descend even deeper into the sacred divine workshop where the word becomes flesh. To observe this principle in its absolute kinetic operation, the narrative follows the consciousness as it glides past the softening light of the alpha corridor and descends into the velvet, silent depths of the hall of theta. This is the chamber of the subconscious mind, the sacred workshop where the formless substance of the universe is permanently molded into physical form. The atmosphere here is one of profound, ancient majesty. The noise of the outside storm has been completely extinguished. Not a single echo of the wind or the rain can penetrate the thick, crystalline walls of this sanctuary. The air is cool, still, and heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient paper, vibrating with a quiet, timeless authority. In the exact mathematical center of this cavernous chamber stands a grand mahogany desk. It is carved from a single, colossal tree that grew in the primal forests of the spirit, its dark wood swirling with iridescent grains that seem to pulse with a faint, internal golden light. Upon the smooth, polished surface of this desk lies a massive, historical ledger bound in weathered, heavy leather. This volume is the terrestrial record of the soul's financial experience. For decades, the pages of this ledger have been filled with the jagged, trembling red ink of not enough. There are meticulous, ugly entries recording old debts, ancestral patterns of lack, bankruptcies of the past, and the exhausting daily tallies of unrewarded labor. The red ink appears permanent, etched so deeply into the fibers of the paper by the steady hand of fear that the logical mind would declare it completely indelible. The seeker steps forward, standing before the grand mahogany desk. On the porch, this individual was a beggar shivering in the rain. Here, in the hall of theta, they stand as a sovereign magistrate reclaiming a throne. The hand does not shake. Bypassing the blunt instruments of physical struggle, the fingers reach out and pick up a heavy, magnificent pen crafted from pure, condensed golden light, the materialization of the wand of the spoken word. With an unhurried, deliberate motion, the golden pen is brought down to the surface of the ancient ledger. There is no frantic scratching or defensive editing. Instead, the moment the golden nib touches the paper, a brilliant, silent thermal frequency emanates from the point of contact. The ancient red script of debt, limitation, and financial bondage begins to dissolve under the heat of the light. The letters turn into a faint white vapor, lifting off the page and drifting away into the nothingness from which they originally came. The paper is cleansed, returning to a pristine, radiant white. The golden pen begins to move across the clean page with elegant precision. It does not write wishes or hopes, it engraves absolute decrees into the fabric of reality. The golden ink flows steadily, carving beautiful permanent characters into the ledger. Prosperity absolute, inexhaustible supply, divine rebate, avalanches of abundance. As each word is finished, the golden ink sinks deep into the page, becoming one with the substance of the book. The subconscious mind, acting as a flawless, non-judgmental recording station, accepts these new entries as the absolute and unalterable law of existence. It immediately begins to rearrange the atomic structure of the outer world, shifting the tides of circumstance, moving people across continents, and opening unexpected channels to ensure that the physical world conforms precisely to the golden script of the master. The integration of this architectural truth demands a radical, uncompromising reorientation of the waking life. The individual can no longer afford to live as a shivering inhabitant of the porch while claiming to own the wealth of the mansion. To embody this reality today, the seeker must practice the art of systematic mental withdrawal. When the physical senses report a deficit, or when the mechanical mind attempts to initiate a panic-driven calculation of survival, the master must instantly recognize that the report is merely a ghost of yesterday's porch thinking, a dead shadow, reflecting an entry that has already been permanently deleted from the cosmic ledger. The practical integration requires the cultivation of a majestic, sacred indifference toward the external reflection. When a financial obligation arrives, or when the physical mirror displays the temporary illusion of scarcity, the mind must refuse to engage in battle. To fight the lack is to run back out onto the wet planks of the porch and shake a fist at the storm, thereby resetting the radio dial back to the frequency of emergency. Instead, the individual must turn their back on the storm, retreat mentally into the silent corridors of Alpha and Theta, and remain anchored in the absolute certainty that the golden entries have already been written. The physical world is legally bound by universal law to materialize the contents of the inner ledger. As the mind begins to settle into this profound certainty, let the spirit pause for a moment of deep reflection. If these insights awaken a latent recognition of your own sovereign power, take a deliberate moment to anchor this alignment by liking this transmission and subscribing to the sanctuary. By doing so, you ensure these timeless laws continue to guide your journey. The consciousness has now successfully left the porch, crossed the threshold of the bronze doors, and rewritten its financial law upon the grand mahogany desk of the subconscious workshop. The old red ink has been dissolved into mist, and the new golden standard has been deeply engraved into the soul. Yet, a profound mystery remains at the edge of this inner estate. As the traveler prepares to move deeper into the mansion, seeking the ultimate treasure vault of the Delta state, the place where the individual self dissolves into complete oneness with the opulent substance of the infinite creator, a massive, shimmering barrier is encountered. The heavy doors leading into the deepest sanctuary of supply remain tightly locked, refusing to yield to the golden pen or the sovereign decree. The invisible observer notes a critical detail. The traveler has left the storm behind, yet their hand still instinctively clenches a heavy iron weapon, their muscles rigid with the memory of the daily fight. The gateway to absolute abundance cannot receive a soul that is postured for combat, and the path forward is blocked by the very energy used to escape the rain. The narrative leaves the seeker standing at this breathtaking, silent threshold, where the ultimate key to the treasury requires an act of radical surrender, the complete dropping of the iron weapon, setting the stage for the profound and terrifying revelation of the law of non-resistance which awaits in the depths of the next chapter. The landscape of human effort transforms into a vast twilight plain under a sky devoid of color. The air is cold and thin, smelling of parched earth and static electricity. Across this barren expanse, an invisible observer watches a warrior engaged in an endless, agonizing combat. The warrior is armed with a colossal sword forged from heavy black iron, its edge nicked and dulled from countless encounters. His face is a mask of absolute exhaustion. Sweat mixes with the dust of the plain, carving dark streaks down his hollow cheeks, and his breath comes in ragged, desperate gasps that rattle in his chest. The warrior's enemy is not a creature of flesh and bone. He is locked in a furious, unrelenting battle with the long, stretching shadows that creep across the ground as the sun sinks below the horizon. With a primal scream of defiance, the warrior swings the heavy iron blade, driving it with all his remaining physical force through a towering patch of darkness. The blade cuts through the blackness with a sharp hiss, striking the stony ground with a sickening jar that vibrates through the warrior's gnarled hands and up into his brittle spine. Yet, when the dust settles, the shadow remains perfectly intact, completely unmoved by the violent passage of the iron. Herein lies the profound and tragic paradox of the plane. The harder the warrior strikes, the more the shadows seem to multiply, lengthen, and deepen. Every drop of sweat he sheds, every ounce of nervous energy he expends in his furious defense, only leaves him weaker, more blind, and more vulnerable to the creeping dark. The blade passes through the shadow because the shadow has no independent material substance. It is merely an absence of light. The warrior is entirely unaware that the terrifying size of the enemy is being dictated by the sun setting directly behind his own back. By turning his face to fight the darkness, he has oriented himself away from the source of illumination, ensuring that his own physical form projects the very monsters he is trying to destroy. He is sacrificing his lifeblood to combat an illusion, attempting to conquer through physical violence a phantom that can only be dissolved by the quiet act of turning around. To pierce the illusion that keeps the human soul chained to this exhausting combat upon the plane of survival, one must apply the relentless edge of recursive inquiry. The wise observer must look beneath the physical mechanics of the struggle and ask the foundational question: why does the human mind possess an instinctual, almost frantic compulsion to fight the appearance of financial lack? And how does this internal resistance legally bind the soul to the very poverty it seeks to escape? When the mind is confronted by the cold reality of an unpaid bill, a failed venture, or a dwindling resource, the primal survival mechanisms of the brain instantly misinterpret the data. The analytical intellect, operating on the noisy front porch of the physical senses, perceives the deficit not as a temporary configuration of energy, but as an active, aggressive predator threatening its very existence. The immediate internal reaction is friction, anger, resentment, panic and defensive planning. The mind screams that it must do something, it must fight, it must hustle, and it must construct a fortress of anxiety to protect itself from the impending ruin. This internal friction, however, triggers an unyielding metaphysical law that governs the structural fabric of reality. The universe functions as an absolute, non-judgmental mirror. It does not respond to what a human being wishes for in their moments of casual hope. It responds with mathematical precision to the core identity and vibrational frequency that occupies the deepest chambers of the soul. When an individual enters a state of fierce resistance against their financial circumstances, when they hate their debts, curse the economic system, and worry over the empty spaces in their account with a panicked heart, they are committing a catastrophic energetic error. They are granting the shadow the illusion of solidity. By analyzing this process through the metaphor of the radio dial, the mechanism becomes clear. The universe is a vast, multidimensional broadcast system containing every potentiality simultaneously. The frequency of infinite supply and the frequency of total starvation exist in the exact same coordinate of space and time. When you fight a circumstance with intense emotional energy, you are not destroying that circumstance. You are tuning your internal receiver directly to its precise coordinate. You are locking the dial into the station of famine. Because resistance requires a high concentration of focused attention, and because whatever receives the focus of human consciousness automatically multiplies, the soul inadvertently acts as the primary architect of its own prison. The intense anxiety directed at the unpaid bill transforms the bill into an absolute sovereign ruler over the imagination. The physical world, acting as the echo chamber of the spirit, has no choice but to reverberate the sound of that panic, returning to the individual a magnified, distorted chorus of more bills, more deficits, and more opportunities for desperate combat. Resistance is, in truth, the strongest of spiritual glues. It binds the shadow to the soul with chains of tempered steel. To break this cycle, the traveler must master the ancient mystical art of non-resistance. This is the profound teaching that has stood as a quiet sentinel through the centuries. Resist not the appearance of evil, but overcome the appearance of deficit with the absolute realization of good. To become non-resistant does not mean to descend into passivity, weakness, or fatalistic surrender. It is rather the ultimate demonstration of supreme spiritual poise and royal authority. It is the conduct of a being who is so entirely rooted in the knowledge of their divine supply that the temporary appearance of lack cannot move them by even a fraction of an inch. The non-resistant soul looks at the empty account and refuses to grant it the power to cause a single tremor of fear. They look through the shadow, recognizing it as a harmless phantom, and calmly declare, "This is not a void. It is merely the fertile, silent ground where my gold is currently forming beneath the surface." By dropping the iron sword of struggle, the internal radio dial is instantly released from the frequency of emergency, allowing the mind to stabilize upon the tranquil waters of absolute expectancy. The practical, unyielding operation of this law is perfectly demonstrated through the historical experience of an individual named Avery. Avery was a professional of immense intellectual capability, a master of design and structural coordination who possessed a rare talent for seeing the hidden elegance in raw materials. Yet for many years, Avery lived in a state of complete financial standstill. Every project Avery initiated seemed to wither and dry up at the exact moment of completion. Contracts that were virtually finalized would suddenly vanish due to unexpected bureaucratic shifts. Clients who had promised massive investments would abruptly cease communication without explanation. Avery responded to this perpetual stagnation by sharpening the iron sword of the hustle. Avery worked 18-hour days, moving through the city with an aggressive, breathless velocity. Avery fought with competitors in the silent theater of the mind, resented the rising costs of the marketplace, and viewed every financial obligation as a personal assault by a hostile world. The physical body bore the heavy record of this constant warfare. Avery woke every single morning with a clenched jaw, so rigid it caused a perpetual dull ache in the temples, a physical manifestation of the determination to force money into reality through sheer muscular effort and mental friction. Avery was a master of the struggle, yet the struggle was producing nothing but silver hairs, a brittle spirit, and an increasingly empty vault. The turning point arrived when Avery was brought to a state of complete physical and emotional exhaustion, forced to realize that the frantic energy of the fight was the very wall blocking the arrival of supply. Avery encountered the timeless law of non-resistance and understood that the clenched jaw was not a tool of success but a tightly locked gate keeping the abundance of the universe out of reach. Avery made a radical, terrifying decision to drop the weapon. Avery retreated into the silent sanctuary of the inner mind, sitting motionless in the stillness of the early morning hours. Instead of reviewing the long list of financial threats, Avery consciously relaxed the muscles of the face, letting the jaw go slack and releasing the heavy luggage of worry from the shoulders. Avery looked directly at the impending financial deficits, and instead of cursing them with fear, spoke to them with the calm poise of a sovereign magistrate. Infinite Spirit, I no longer fight my circumstances. I am a non-resistant being. I stand perfectly still, and I see the salvation of the law. I give thanks that my good now reaches me in a perfect way under grace. At first, the logical intellect screamed with terror, declaring that to cease fighting was to invite immediate destruction. But the law of the Spirit is exact and cannot be mocked. As Avery systematically withdrew all resistance from the world stopped resisting Avery. The internal radio dial had been shifted away from the frequency of emergency. Within 2 weeks of maintaining this state of sacred neutrality, a former competitor, an individual whom Avery had previously resented and fought in the marketplace, reached out with an unexpected proposal. The rival was launching a global initiative and needed exactly Avery's rare design expertise. The joint venture was structured with such total harmony that it surpassed every individual goal Avery had ever attempted to achieve through struggle, providing an avalanche of wealth that flowed in like a deep, serene river. Avery had ceased to be a jagged rock creating friction in the stream. Avery had become the water itself. To integrate the majestic power of non-resistance into the coordinates of daily life, the seeker must initiate an immediate disarmament of the mind. When the physical senses present an image of lack, or when the external mirror reflects a temporary delay in the arrival of supply, the master must absolutely refuse to pick up the sword of mental combat. The practical application of this truth requires the cultivation of a profound, royal poise in the presence of appearance. The individual must train themselves to look at an outstanding debt or an economic challenge and say to the circumstance with a quiet, steady smile, I see your shadow, phantom, but you have no underlying substance. My infinite spirit is my only true material. This is the moment to set the heavy pack of worry down upon the floor of the divine workshop. The traveler must recognize that trying to figure out the physical how of supply is an act of fierce resistance, a desperate attempt by the logical mind to stand in the doorway of its own mansion, physically blocking the treasure from entering. The how is the exclusive business of the infinite spirit, which possesses 10,000 ways of delivering the harvest that the analytical intellect could not imagine in a millennium of thinking. The soul's only obligation is to remain in the quiet corridor of expectancy, keeping the hands open and the spirit completely uncontracted. As the mind stabilizes within this grand, non-resistant certainty, let the consciousness pause for a moment of deep, sacred reflection. As the spirit absorbs the sublime truth of non-resistance, let the inner self become perfectly still. If these timeless principles awaken a deep remembrance of your native sovereignty over the world of form, take a deliberate moment to anchor this alignment by liking this transmission and subscribing to the sanctuary. Through this quiet act of devotion, you ensure these eternal laws continue to illuminate your path. The warrior has dropped the iron blade upon the plain of twilight. The hands are finally empty, the jaw is relaxed, and the spirit is light, completely free from the exhausting friction of the financial fight. Because the soul has refused to give its precious focus to the shadow, the chains of resistance have dissolved into white vapor. The traveler stands before the heavy bronze doors of the mansion, no longer a combatant trying to force the entrance, but an heir whose mere presence commands the gates to open. The path ahead clears, revealing a long, luminous pathway that leads away from the workshop and into a grand, ancient garden hidden deep within the heart of the estate. The air here begins to vibrate with a strange celebratory resonance, the distant sound of a silver trumpet echoing through the midnight hours. The traveler is about to cross the threshold into a season of absolute cosmic restoration, where every past financial error is destined to be legally nullified, and every debt erased from the ledger of time. The narrative leaves the seeker poised at the edge of this radiant garden, where the ancient mystery of the spiritual jubilee waits to wipe the cosmic slate completely clean, beckoning the soul into the majestic revelations of the chapter that lies directly ahead. The landscape of consciousness transforms into a vast, blinding white desert under the relentless glare of a stationary noon sun. The horizon offers no relief, vibrating with an intense, shimmering heat distortion that blurs the boundary between the parched earth and the empty sky. Across the burning, golden dunes, a lone traveler moves with agonizing slowness. Every step is a monument to sheer physical suffering. The traveler is not walking freely. Around raw, swollen ankles, heavy iron bands are fastened, connected to thick, blackened chains that trail behind into the sand. At the end of these rattling links lies an immense iron safe, deeply pitted with orange rust and scarred by the friction of 1,000 miles of travel. Inside this iron vault, the traveler has meticulously preserved the heavy, brittle, yellowed records of a lifetime of financial trauma. Within its locked chambers reside the ghosts of every past deficit, old default notices, the memory of sour investments, bank statements from years of struggle, and the silent, crushing weight of unfulfilled obligations. The traveler's gaze is locked downward, entirely consumed by the immediate mechanics of the struggle, watching the heavy iron safe plow a deep, ugly trench through the burning sand. The mind is filled with a singular, exhausting conviction that this burden is permanent, that the record of the past must be carried until the end of days, and that the present self must continuously pay the price for the errors of yesterday. Now, observe the profound and tragic paradox that defines this arid plain. Less than 20 paces directly ahead of the traveler's path, the desert abruptly fractures. The blinding sand gives way to a breathtaking emerald green oasis, a magnificent sanctuary hidden within the folds of the wilderness. Here, cool, crystal-clear springs bubble up from the deep artesian basins of the earth, feeding groves of ancient date palms that cast wide, violet shadows across pathways of lush, damp moss. The air within this sanctuary is sweet, cool, and laden with the scent of blooming night flowers, offering an immediate, total release from the tyranny of the sun. Yet, because the traveler's neck is bent double under the psychological weight of the safe, their eyes never lift from the sand. They are completely blind to the presence of immediate luxury and liberation standing right before their face. They choose instead to remain a captive to the heavy iron box, completely unaware that the lock on the safe has no key, and that the chains binding it to their ankles are held together by nothing more substantial than the intensity of their own focused attention. To dissolve the illusion that keeps the human soul chained to the heavy safe of financial memory, one must apply the uncompromising scalpel of recursive thinking. The wise, invisible observer must look past the physical appearance of liability and ask the foundational questions. Why does the human mind preserve the record of its past financial wounds with such fierce protective loyalty? How does this psychological retention function within the immutable law of the cosmic mirror? The analytical intellect, operating within the defensive parameters of survival logic, believes that by continuously reviewing, remembering, and fearing its past financial failures, it can construct a shield against future catastrophe. It whispers that to forget the debt is to be reckless, and to release the memory of the loss is to invite ruin once again. This, however, is a profound metaphysical delusion. The subconscious mind does not possess a mechanism for linear time. It operates within a permanent, continuous state of the eternal now. When an individual reviews a past financial error, when they lie awake in the dark counting the accumulated debts of the past decade, or when they feel the sharp, biting shame of a sour investment, the subconscious does not perceive these events as history. It processes the emotional vibration as an active, current command for the present moment. This internal retention triggers the precise operation of the mirror of reality. The physical environment can never reflect a future of unrestricted wealth, while the soul stands before it draped in the heavy shroud of past guilt and self-condemnation. The universe is entirely non-judgmental. It merely takes the prevailing self-concept held within the deep chambers of the spirit and translates it into a physical fact. If the internal ledger of the mind is filled with the red ink of past liabilities, The external mirror has no choice but to project a continuous sequence of matching debts, unexpected expenses, and frozen opportunities. The environment becomes the literal, unyielding echo of that internal judgment. By exploring this dynamic through the metaphor of the radio dial, the mechanism of the spiritual jubilee becomes clear. The universe is a vast, multi-layered frequency field, containing all potential realities simultaneously. The station of absolute liberation and the station of punitive debt operate in the same coordinate of time and space. When you maintain an internal record of your financial sins, you are manually holding the radio dial locked into the frequency of retribution. You are decreeing that you must suffer a period of hard labor to pay a price for your ignorance. The law of the Jubilee, however, is the law of radical substitution. The understanding that the moment the internal word is changed, the old karma is instantly neutralized. Why must the soul transition from the law of hard labor to the law of grace? Because hard labor is an attempt by the finite human ego to settle an infinite debt using the limited currency of time and physical friction. Grace, conversely, is the immediate recognition that in the divine mind, no debt has ever been recorded. The infinite spirit does not keep a ledger of human errors. It knows only its own inexhaustible opulence. To enter the Jubilee is to step out from under the artificial laws of human cause and effect and align the internal dial with the sovereign truth of your divine inheritance, where the slate is wiped completely clean by the hand of grace. The unyielding operation of this cosmic clearance is beautifully demonstrated through the historical narrative of an individual named Elena. Elena was a seeker of immense capability, a visionary who possessed a rare talent for structural organization and commercial strategy. Yet, for a consecutive decade, Elena found herself walking through a financial desert that appeared to have no end. She was buried beneath an immense mountain of debt left behind by a series of retail ventures that had collapsed during a severe global economic contraction. The burden was not merely a matter of arithmetic, it was a deeply rooted, biting shame that acted as a constant, heavy weight upon her solar plexus. Every evening, as the darkness settled over her room, Elena would lie in the stillness and surrender her mind to a destructive ritual of self-condemnation. She would review the contracts she had signed, curse her own naivety, and tell her subconscious mind that she was a fool who would be trapped in this financial hole for the remainder of her life. She was using the magnificent wand of her spoken word to build the very walls of her prison. Predictably, her physical reality conformed perfectly to this internal script. Whenever a small stream of income appeared, an unexpected emergency, a legal fee, a medical cost, or a sudden equipment failure would instantly arise to sweep the money away. She was trapped in an absolute echo chamber of lack, reaping exactly what she was sowing in the soil of her mind. The transformation began when Elena encountered the spiritual law of the Jubilee and realized that the mountain of debt was not made of stone, but of her own repeated words. She resolved to initiate a practice of total divine erasure. Elena went out and purchased a pristine, beautifully crafted ledger bound in cream-colored linen, its pages thick, white, and completely blank. On the very first page, using a pen filled with steady, beautiful ink, she wrote the title, "The Record of My Divine Overflow." Elena made a sovereign contract with her future self to completely cease reporting on the desert. Every time a collection notice arrived in her mailbox, she refused to grant it the power to cause an internal contraction. Instead, she would lay her hand upon the paper, bless the creditor with love, and speak directly to the mountain of lack with a voice of quiet, total authority. Infinite Spirit, I give thanks that the law of Jubilee is now in permanent effect in my life. Every debt is completely wiped out in the invisible. I am free, for God is my absolute paymaster under grace. For weeks, the physical world mocked her efforts. The numbers in her bank account remained dangerously low, and the creditors continued to call with voices of stone. But Elena had mastered the secret of the shout of victory. She understood that the ancient walls of limitation do not fall because they are physically pushed, but because the soul celebrates the triumph while the obstacle is still standing. She filled her mind with the sensory reality of freedom, clearing out the old filing cabinets where the records of failure were kept and preparing her inner house for abundance. The manifestation arrived through a perfect, unpredictable channel that no human intellect could have planned. Elena received a certified notice from a multinational corporation she had subcontracted for nearly 12 years prior, a legal entity she had completely forgotten existed. The notice detailed a massive class action regulatory settlement regarding unpaid royalties that had been quietly moving through the courts for a decade. The check that accompanied the notice was, almost to the exact penny, the precise sum required to dissolve every liability she owed to her creditors, with an immense surplus left over to fund her next vision. The breakthrough had nothing to do with hard labor. It was a direct manifestation of the word. Elena had cast her burden into the sea of nothingness, and the divine paymaster had settled the account in full. To embody the majestic freedom of the spiritual jubilee within the coordinates of daily life, the individual must initiate an immediate, total, internal audit. The practical integration of this truth requires the absolute cessation of looking at the past through the eyes of a judge. The traveler must mentally walk into the garden of their own subconscious mind and locate the wall of I owe, I lost, and I failed. You must look at these stony monuments of lack, not with hatred or anger, but with a heart of total forgiveness, recognizing that they are made of nothing more permanent than your own old words. Every outstanding bill that reaches the hand from this day forward must be treated as a sign of absolute supply. The master must refuse to wince or contract at the price tag of existence. As the money goes out, it must be sent forth with a deep internal blessing, wrapped in the unwavering knowledge that whatever is released in love must return to the channel multiplied 1,000-fold. The internal radio dial must be firmly shifted away from the frequency of retribution and locked into the frequency of immediate permanent release. The safe must be dropped into the sand of the wilderness, allowing the heavy iron chains to melt away into vapor under the heat of the divine truth. The ledger is clean. The old red entries of limitation have been dissolved into white mist, and the path ahead is clear. As the traveler leaves the oasis of the Jubilee, the scenery shifts once more, moving away from the sun-drenched dunes toward the subterranean foundations of the inner estate. The air begins to cool dramatically, turning from the sweet warmth of the garden into a deep, pulsing violet luminescence that vibrates with a profound alchemical energy. In the distance stands a grand circular chamber built from blocks of solid obsidian, its entrance guarded by silent columns of violet fire. The safe has been left behind in the desert, yet the traveler notices a final subtle layer of restriction, a weathered heavy mask clinging tightly to their features. The mask of hereditary poverty, the genetic expectation of struggle handed down by ancestors who feared the winter and hoarded crumbs in the dark. The gateway to absolute abundance cannot receive a soul that still wears the face of a servant. To claim the ultimate gold, the soul must now step into the alchemical fire to melt down this false face forever, setting the stage for the deep, transformative resets that await in the magnificent chamber of the next chapter. The journey of the soul descends into the deep subterranean foundations of the inner estate, far beneath the shifting sands of memory and the quiet galleries of the subconscious mind. Here the air cools dramatically, stripping away the gentle warmth of the outer gardens and replacing it with a stillness that vibrates at a dense, immense frequency. An invisible observer stands within a grand circular amphitheater constructed entirely from massive blocks of polished obsidian. The walls are so perfectly dark that they seem to swallow space itself, yet the room is not blind. It is bathed in a deep, pulsing violet luminescence that emanates from silent, vertical columns of cold fire rising from the perimeter of the floor. In the center of this majestic room stands a traveler, positioned directly before an ancient, towering mirror framed in untarnished gold. When the traveler looks into the glass, the reflection that greets them is not a clear image of their divine nature, but a terrifying display of historical limitation. The traveler is wearing a heavy, weathered mask crafted from thick, dull lead. This mask has been worn for so many consecutive decades, through so many long winters of anxiety, that its edges have begun to fuse with the very skin of the face beneath it. Look closely at the surface of this leaden countenance. It is etched with deep, jagged lines of hypervigilance, ancestral caution, and the permanent expression of one who constantly winces against an impending blow from an unmerciful environment. The eyes of the mask are narrow, shaped by a genetic expectation of shortage, perpetually scanning the dark for the arrival of the next financial winter. The profound paradox of the chamber is revealed. The traveler treats this heavy, suffocating mask as their authentic flesh. They move through existence, believing that this face of restriction belongs to them, entirely unaware that it is an external garment handed down like a tattered, ill-fitting shroud. Underneath the cold, leaden weight of this false identity lies the untarnished, pristine countenance of a sovereign child of the king, a face of pure, radiant gold that has never known a deficit, waiting to be liberated from the legacy of the dead. To melt the leaden mask and liberate the golden identity hidden beneath its surface, one must apply the unyielding mechanics of recursive thinking. The wise observer must look past the immediate symptoms of poverty consciousness and ask the foundational questions. Why does the human soul inherit the financial famine of its predecessors with such absolute genetic fidelity? How does the invisible framework of self-concept enforce this ancestral limitation through the immutable laws of reality? The answers require a profound investigation into the psychological anatomy of the ancestral thermostat. The human infant does not enter the world with a native belief in scarcity. It arrives as an open, receiving channel for the absolute extravagance of the Creator. However, during the fragile, formative years of early development, the subconscious mind acts as a highly sensitive recorder, absorbing the vibrations of its environment without filter or judgment. When a child witnesses a parent clenching their jaw over a bill, hears the bitter whispers of adults declaring that money is an enemy or a resource reserved only for the corrupt, or inherits the deep, quiet terror of a lineage that lost everything in an economic crash, the mind registers these traumas as absolute rules of survival. The subconscious intellect reasons that to outgrow the financial status of the family lineage is a form of betrayal, a dangerous departure from the tribal norms that ensured the safety of the species. Therefore, it constructs an internal financial thermostat locked tightly to the freezing point of family history. This brings the deconstruction to the precise operation of the mirror of cosmic reality. The universe cannot project a physical environment of effortless abundance, while the soul standing before it insists on answering to the name of a beggar. The mirror can only reflect the core identity held in the absolute silence of the spirit. If your ancestral name in the invisible is the one who must struggle, the external world has no choice but to conform to that definition with mathematical precision. By analyzing this dynamic through the metaphor of the radio dial, the mechanism of hereditary limitation becomes entirely transparent. The genetic patterns of fear act as a heavy weight that manually pins the radio dial to a low, dense broadcast frequency. Even when a person possesses immense talent, works 18-hour days, and attempts to force prosperity into reality through sheer muscular hustle, they are still broadcasting from the station of ancestral famine. The external world merely functions as the echo chamber of that underlying vibration. Every temporary breakthrough, every sudden influx of currency is instantly neutralized by the internal thermostat. The subconscious mind, acting as a misguided protector, will systematically orchestrate a tool breakage, a sudden tax liability, or a collapsed contract to cool the external reality back down to the familiar, safe temperature of inherited poverty. To break the cycle, the soul must enter the alchemical fire of the spoken word, dissolve the old name in the invisible, and forge an identity entirely decoupled from the errors of history. The absolute unyielding operation of this alchemical reset is vividly demonstrated through the historical experience of an individual named Silas. Silas was a craftsman of profound, unmatched capability, a visionary master of design who could look at a raw block of cedar or a cold slab of marble and see the hidden, elegant geometry of a masterpiece. Yet, despite his immense skill, Silas lived in a state of perpetual grayness. He resided and worked within a narrow, drafts-swept workshop that smelled of stale sawdust, damp earth, and unfulfilled potential. Every morning, as the wind rattled his windows, Silas's first conscious act was a frantic mental calculation of his immediate debts. Silas was not merely fighting his own circumstances, he was carrying the heavy, unperceived weight of his lineage. He came from a long line of laborers who believed with a fierce religious intensity that grueling physical pain was the only honorable path to survival, and that financial ease was a dangerous illusion. Silas's father had worked until his hands were gnarled like tree roots, and his spirit was completely brittle, dying with an empty purse and a heart full of resentment. Silas carried a deep subconscious loyalty to that gnarled legacy. In the invisible realm, his true name was the man who must fight for every penny. Predictably, his life was a perfect reflection of that name. Whenever he was on the precipice of a commercial breakthrough, a catastrophic disruption would inevitably occur to sweep his savings away. The transformation began when Silas encountered the law of the word and was forced to look at the leaden mask he was wearing. He realized that he was not a poor craftsman trying to find wealth, but a wealthy being who had been lulled into an ancestral nightmare. Silas made a sovereign decision to enter his internal alchemical chamber. He sat motionless in the center of his dark workshop, closed his eyes to the physical environment, and mentally stepped before the golden vessel of violet light. Silas took every label the world, and his family had ever pinned to his shoulders the label of unlucky, the label of the working poor, and the memory of his father's struggle, and dropped them deliberately into the alchemical fire. He watched as the violet flames dissolved the gray stories of not enough into nothingness. From that clean slate, Silas began the practice of spiritual renaming. Every morning, before touching a tool, he would stand in the silence and declare his true nature with a voice of quiet, total authority. I am Silas the Wealthy. I am the child of the extravagant Creator. This laboratory is no longer the site of my struggle. It is the majestic birthplace of my millions. My supply is immediate, permanent, and inexhaustible. At first, his logical intellect mocked him, pointing to the dust on his floor and the smallness of his accounts. But Silas stayed in the knowing, refusing to report on the shadow. He began to move with the unhurried poise of the opulent, treating his simple tools as if they were carved from solid gold. Within 3 months of resetting his internal thermostat, Silas was unexpectedly approached by an international architectural firm. They had discovered a small piece of his work in a distant gallery and commissioned him to design the complete interior of a great metropolitan cathedral. The contract was a divine rebate for all the years he had spent in the dark, providing an immediate influx of wealth that completely transformed his lineage and established a new gold standard for his family name forever. To embody the majestic transformation of the alchemical chamber within the coordinates of daily life, the seeker must initiate an immediate act of divine ancestral disconnection. The practical integration of this truth requires that you turn your face away from the historical records of shortage. You must mentally stand before the long line of your ancestors, blessing them for your physical life, thanking them for their strength, yet firmly refusing to carry their heavy bags of worry into the sunlight of the present moment. The poverty line of your lineage must end at your feet, and the wealth line must begin with your next breath. When you arise from your bed each morning, before the noise of the world or the notifications of a digital device can enter your consciousness, you must sit up and anchor your new name in the invisible. Speak your morning decree with the absolute resonance of a sovereign ruler. I awake as a wealthy person. The leaden mask has been dissolved, and my true countenance of gold is revealed. Walk through the doorways of your home with the poise, the stride, and the ease of an individual who owns the world and everything within it, refusing to grant temporary challenges the power to reset your internal thermostat to the frequency of fear. As the mind stabilizes within this grand alchemical certainty, let the spirit pause for a moment of profound reflection. As the soul reclaims its royal lineage and throws off the false face of restriction, let the inner self settle into an absolute peace. If this grand reclamation of your true identity resonates with the deepest chambers of your spirit, take a deliberate moment to anchor this alignment by liking this transmission and subscribing to the sanctuary. Through this conscious act, you ensure these timeless laws continue to guide your ascent. The leaden mask has been completely melted down in the violet fire of the chamber. The face of the servant is gone, dissolved into nothingness, and the radiant countenance of the sovereign master has been permanently established. The traveler stands before the golden mirror, looking at a reflection that is rich, full, and completely aligned with the extravagance of the cosmos. The path ahead opens once more, leading upward from the subterranean foundations of the mind toward a wide, luminous terrace that overlooks a boundless, shimmering horizon. The air here changes completely, becoming heavy with the scent of sea salt and the vibrant, roaring promise of an infinite tide. The traveler has rewritten their identity, yet they are about to encounter the final, ultimate expansion of the law of supply. The narrative leaves the seeker standing at the edge of this breathtaking terrace where the deep golden waters of an endless sea wait to wash away the last remaining traces of human limitation, beckoning the soul into the majestic, shoreless revelations of the chapter that lies directly ahead. The landscape of human enterprise opens upon a spectacular white stone metropolis nestled in the basin of an ancient valley. The city is a masterpiece of classical architecture, adorned with towering columns of polished ivory, wide public plazas paved with silver-veined courts, and bustling marketplaces that hum with the vibrant energy of global commerce. Yet for all its structural grandeur, the lifeblood of this great city is entirely dependent upon a singular engineering marvel, an immense stone aqueduct that spans the mountain peaks, bringing a steady, cool stream of alpine water down into the valley through a massive central bronze pipe. For centuries, the citizens have gathered around this single conduit, treating its mouth as the absolute origin of their vitality, their survival, and their wealth. One morning, deep seismic tremors ripple through the bedrock of the valley. High up in the jagged cliffs, a massive boulder detaches from the mountain face, crashing down with a deafening roar upon the stone aqueduct. The primary conduit fractures instantly. Down in the city plaza, the roaring stream of water falters, slowing to a sluggish trickle before running completely dry. The sudden silence that follows is terrifying. Within minutes, a frantic, hysterical multitude descends upon the central plaza. Thousands of citizens pack the square in a state of absolute hypervigilant panic, crowding around the dry bronze opening. They tear at their luxurious clothes, fall to their knees in the dust, and begin to weep openly over the dead pipe. Some bring small iron spoons, desperately scraping at the damp, dark silt remaining inside the mouth of the conduit, fighting one another over individual drops of stagnant moisture. They scream queries into the hollow dark of the tube, begging the stone to relent, and curse the changing world for their sudden starvation. They are completely paralyzed by the conviction that because this specific pipe has ceased to flow, the element of water itself has vanished from the face of the earth. Now, lift the perspective away from the weeping crowd and climb the steep, rocky ridges that border the northern wall of the city. As the view expands past the perimeter of human habitation, a breathtaking geographical reality is revealed. Just a mere 100 paces over the crest of the hill, completely hidden from the eyes of the plaza below, lies a boundless, shoreless sapphire ocean. This immense body of water stretches outward into the infinite horizon, its surface shimmering with a brilliant golden light. Colossal waves of pure, crystal-clear water throw themselves against the coastal rocks with an unstoppable, majestic force, releasing a rich mist that blankets the landscape in absolute fertility. The ocean contains enough moisture to fill 1 billion aqueducts and sustain 1,000 empires for eternity. The profound paradox of the valley is laid bare. The citizens are sacrificing their dignity and tearing themselves apart over a handful of mud at the mouth of a broken pipe, entirely unaware that the absolute source of all water is resting in its infinite, roaring majesty just yards behind the hill. To understand why the human intellect remains habitually hypnotized by the tiny, fragile conduit while remaining completely blind to the shoreless ocean of supply, one must apply the unyielding edge of recursive thinking. The wise, invisible observer must look past the immediate panic of the economic landscape and ask the foundational questions. Why does the human mind consistently mistake the delivery mechanism for the absolute origin of wealth? How does this psychological fixation on specific channels legally bind the soul to a reality of perpetual anxiety? The answer requires a rigorous deconstruction of the evolutionary errors embedded within the analytical mind. The conscious intellect, operating under the survival directives of the high-frequency beta state, is fundamentally a creature of isolation. It can only understand reality through the narrow lens of fragmentation. When an individual secures a lucrative employment contract, establishes a successful business relationship, or receives a significant inheritance, the logical brain immediately reifies this specific channel. It identifies the employer, the client, or the investment as the source of their financial life. This identification is a profound metaphysical catastrophe. It is the error of mistaking the shadow for the hand that casts it, or the echo for the original voice. When you believe that your wealth is generated by a specific human institution or a singular economic channel, you automatically transfer your sovereign power over to that external form. You transform the channel into a false idol. The psychological consequence of this idolatry is immediate and severe. Hypervigilance and quiet terror take up permanent residence within the soul. Because every human channel is inherently subject to the shifting tides of terrestrial change, because businesses can fail, markets can contract, and clients can vanish. The individual who worships the channel must live in constant, breathless fear of pleasing that channel. They alter their boundaries, suppress their intuition, and live a fractional, defensive life, rationing their internal joy, because they believe that if this one tiny pipe is blocked, their entire existence will collapse into absolute ruin. By exploring this dynamic through the metaphor of the mirror of reality, the operational failure becomes transparent. The universe is a non-judgmental reflective glass that can only mirror the core self-concept held within the deep chambers of the spirit. If your underlying assumption is, "I am a helpless dependent whose survival relies entirely upon the favor of this specific employer," the mirror will continuously project an environment that validates that precarity. It will deliver difficult supervisors, unstable market conditions, and a constant sequence of threats to your security. You have used the metaphor of the radio dial to tune your internal receiver directly to the frequency of dependency. The external world merely functions as the echo chamber of that underlying vibration, returning to you the precise acoustic feedback of your own fear. The law of the spirit, however, dictates that the infinite creator has 10,000 channels for every single pipe that becomes clogged by human events. The divine substance does not require a pre-existing logical path of cause and effect to deliver its harvest. It creates its own paths through the wilderness. To break the cycle of anxiety, the soul must undergo a radical psychological divorce. You must deliberately separate the concept of your supply from the concept of the vessel through which it currently flows. The employer or the client is not your provider. They are merely a temporary pipe through which the infinite ocean of opulence has chosen to condense into form for a season. When you divorce the channel and marry the source, your radio dial is permanently locked into the frequency of absolute, immutable security. If a pipe breaks, you do not weep in the dust of the plaza. You look upward with a calm, royal smile, knowing that the infinite spirit is already laying another, grander pipeline directly to your door. The absolute, kinetic operation of this metaphysical realignment is vividly illustrated through the historical experience of an individual named Dorian. Dorian was an enterprise consultant of unmatched capability, a strategic visionary who possessed a rare talent for restructuring complex commercial networks and unlocking immense efficiency for his partners. Externally, Dorian appeared to be the absolute embodiment of modern prosperity. He occupied a magnificent, glass-fronted office suite on the highest floor of a metropolitan skyscraper, wore flawless bespoke tailoring, and moved through the corporate world with an air of calculated confidence. Yet, behind this polished facade of wealth, Dorian was a psychological slave. He was a devout worshiper of a single channel. Nearly 90% of his firm's massive revenue was generated by a single consultation contract with a colossal, multinational manufacturing conglomerate. Dorian had elevated this single client to the status of a deity. He lived in a state of perpetual, quiet terror of displeasing their board of directors. He woke at 3 o'clock every morning to frantically analyze the tone of their emails, altered his artistic and strategic integrity to conform to their conservative expectations, and suppressed his own voice for years. He was operating under a total channel consciousness, treating a single corporate pipe as his absolute ocean of life. Predictably, the unyielding laws of the spirit moved to shatter this false idol, for the universe will always dissolve the structures we build out of our fear to force the soul back to its native truth. An abrupt, historic macroeconomic shift occurred, and the conglomerate was suddenly thrust into a severe, unappealable regulatory liquidation. Their operations ceased overnight. Dorian's primary channel was instantly severed. The effect on his consciousness was catastrophic. He descended immediately into the frantic noise of the beta state, pacing the floors of his office for weeks, screaming into the telephone, calling lawyers, and checking news feeds with a trembling heart. He looked at his financial landscape and saw only an arid, scorched desert where there was once an oasis. When Dorian reached the absolute nadir of his exhaustion, a moment of profound stillness penetrated his panic. He encountered the teachings of the spoken word, and realized with a shock of revelation that he had been weeping over a broken pipe while ignoring the ocean. He resolved to initiate a practice of radical, sacred indifference. He sat motionless in his quiet office, closed his eyes to the physical bankruptcy of the market, and addressed the closed door of his past business with a voice of calm, total authority. "I thank you, vessel, for being a channel for as long as you were. I release you with absolute love, but I now turn my face directly to the source. The infinite spirit is my only true paymaster, my absolute bank, and my permanent supply. I do not care which way the money comes. I only care that it comes from the treasury of the king under grace and in a perfect way." For 21 consecutive days, Dorian stood in the darkness of this transition. In the physical world, no new clients appeared, no checks arrived, and his colleagues whispered that his career was ruined. But Dorian refused to report on the desert. He kept his internal radio dial firmly locked to the frequency of absolute supply, walking through the city streets with the relaxed, unhurried poise of a person who owned the entire infrastructure. On the 22nd day, the phone rang. An executive from a global infrastructure syndicate, an individual Dorian had met briefly at an international conference 3 years prior, reached out unexpectedly. The syndicate was launching a massive multi-continental developmental initiative and required exactly Dorian's rare expertise to oversee the structural architecture. The contract they offered was 10 times the magnitude of the one he had lost, accompanied by absolute creative freedom and a permanent dividend. Dorian had finally learned the ultimate lesson of wealth. The supply is never out there in the terrestrial economy. It is permanently anchored in the unwavering connection to the infinite source. To embody the majestic freedom of source consciousness within the coordinates of your daily existence, you must initiate an immediate, systematic psychological divorce from your current financial channels. The practical integration of this truth requires that you look at your employment, your investments, or your commercial contracts and mentally declare their dependency status. You must state to them, in the silence of your soul, "You are a beautiful channel, but you are not my source. You do not pay me. The infinite spirit pays me through you. I do not fear your closure, for my supply is independent of your form." When you pay your monthly expenses or release currency into the world, you must do so with the wide, open hand of a being who is connected to an endless ocean. You must refuse to wince or calculate with a contracted heart. As the money leaves your palm, send it forth with a silent blessing, knowing that you are simply participating in the divine circulation of an inexhaustible supply. The internal radio dial must be firmly guarded, ensuring that no market report, news broadcast, or temporary delay can shake your alignment from the station of permanent overflow. As the mind stabilizes within this grand, shoreless certainty, let the consciousness pause for a moment of deep, sacred reflection. As the spirit anchors itself in the bottomless ocean of divine substance, let all residual fear of shortage dissolve into the water of life. If this shift from the precarity of the channel to the absolute permanence of the source resonates with the deepest chambers of your soul, take a deliberate moment to anchor this alignment by liking this transmission and subscribing to the sanctuary. Through this conscious act, you seal your eternal covenant with the infinite supply. The traveler has left the terrace behind. The obsession with the tiny delivery tubes of human economy has been washed away by the salt of the spiritual sea. You stand now upon the very shore of the infinite, your spirit expanded to match the vastness of the horizon, your heart beating in perfect harmony with the majestic rise and fall of the golden tide. You are no longer an individual looking for wealth. You are the destination to which all wealth is legally bound to travel. The path ahead shifts once more, moving along the coastal cliffs toward a high, open promontory that juts out over the roaring waters. The air here begins to crackle with an intense electric resonance, turning from the heavy moisture of the sea into a sharp, brilliant clarity that illuminates every blade of grass with a golden aura. The identity has been reset, and the source has been claimed. Yet the traveler observes a final, magnificent instrument waiting to be deployed upon the height. Resting upon an altar of solid white quartz lies a long, radiant wand of command, the power of the direct decree. the structural mechanism of the spoken voice that forces the formless water of the ocean to instantly freeze into the solid bricks of material reality. The soul has learned to love the ocean, but it must now learn to command the waves. The narrative leaves the seeker standing at this breathtaking, majestic precipice where the throat must become a literal instrument of universal legislation, beckoning the soul into the sovereign, world-shaping revelations of the chapter that lies directly ahead. The narrative ascends into the breathtaking verticality of a grand celestial throne room. The space is an absolute monument to architectural majesty, defined by towering columns of pristine white marble that rise toward a vaulted ceiling inlaid with intricate tapestries of historical triumphs and constellations woven from fine silver thread. The floor is a mirror-polished expanse of dark celestial stone that reflects the light of 1,000 eternal torches burning in basins of solid bronze. Upon a magnificent dais at the far end of this hall sits an absolute monarch, adorned in heavy ceremonial robes of deep crimson and gold, crowned with a diadem of rare, shimmering jewels that catch the firelight with every subtle movement. In the monarch's right hand rests the supreme symbol of imperial authority, a long, heavy scepter crafted from pure, untarnished gold, its crown set with a flawless diamond that vibrates with a faint, éternelle luminescence. Yet despite this display of total terrestrial power, the atmosphere within the hall is heavy with a suffocating, tragic sorrow. The monarch is weeping. His head is bowed, his shoulders are slumped under the invisible weight of a profound despair, and his tears fall silently onto the polished stone below. Outside the vast, arched glass windows of the throne room, an ominous and terrifying landscape unfolds. The kingdom is not a fertile garden of abundance. It is a cracked, skeletal wasteland of gray ash and dried riverbeds. The fields are barren, the storehouses are empty, the trees stand like withered claws scratching at a pale, bloodless sky, and the subjects move through the dust like hollow shades caught in a permanent famine. Now, observe the profound and terrifying paradox that governs this imperial sanctuary. The monarch looks out at the dead valley and voices his bitter grief, crying out about the cruelty of the drought, complaining about the empty treasuries, and detailing the progressive ruin of his empire with a voice filled with panic. Every single time his lips part to utter these words of lack, the golden scepter in his hand flashes with a sudden, violent, violet light. The scepter is not a passive ornament. It is a live, highly sensitive cosmic catalyst. Every careless sentence the monarch speaks, every description of famine he mutters, is instantly translated by the scepter into a permanent command for the geography of the realm. The monarch is entirely unaware that he is the primary author of the very desolation he bemoans. He is using his sovereign instrument to systematically dictate the boundaries of his own starvation, carving the lines of poverty into the earth with the very tool designed to summon the gold. To comprehend why the human voice possesses this absolute legislative authority over the atomic structure of the material world, one must initiate a rigorous philosophical and psychological deconstruction of the vocal apparatus. The wise, invisible observer must look past the physical production of sound and ask the foundational questions. Why does the human voice function as the definitive scepter of universal command? How do words, which appear to the physical senses as nothing more than fleeting, weightless vibrations of air, manage to act as precision needles that etch permanent geometric patterns into the formless energy of the cosmos? The answer requires a profound understanding of the throat as the literal seat of vibrational realignment within the architecture of consciousness. The human body is not a static object. It is a highly sophisticated transmission tower. When the mind operates within the quiet chambers of thought, it is working with potential energy, the unformed clay of the spirit. However, when that thought is pulled upward into the throat, when it passes through the vocal cords and is driven into the external world by the force of the breath, it undergoes a momentous metaphysical transformation. It ceases to be a private internal state and becomes a materialized frequency. The spoken word is the exact halfway point between the invisible realm of pure spirit and the visible world of solid matter. It is the act of creation caught in motion. To understand this process with absolute clarity, one must explore the metaphor of the sensitive plate. The universe is not a collection of rigid, indifferent objects. It is a vast, continuous ocean of formless plastic energy that reacts with mathematical precision to every vibrational impact. The spoken word functions exactly like a diamond-tipped stylus moving across a warm wax cylinder. Every sentence you utter releases a specific heavy wave frequency from the laboratory of the throat. If you speak of your debts, if you recount your financial wounds to a friend, or if you describe your life as a constant struggle to get by, you are using the stylus of your voice to deeply engrave the geometry of lack into the sensitive plate of the cosmos. Once that pattern is etched, the universe has no choice but to honor the template. This brings the deconstruction to the profound paradigm known as the square deficit, the absolute law of universal balance, which dictates that true fulfillment must satisfy four equal quadrants of human experience: health, wealth, love, and perfect self-expression. Most seekers commit the critical error of isolating their financial desires from the rest of their structural identity. They pray for money while simultaneously using their voice to curse their health with descriptions of fatigue, or mutate their relationships with words of resentment. The cosmic mirror cannot project a partial geometry. If one corner of the square is broken by a word of limitation, the entire mansion built upon it will inevitably tilt and crumble into the sand. Why must the word be spoken with absolute, unhurried command rather than the hesitant petition of a beggar? Because the universe does not respond to desperation. Desperation is a transmission from the station of famine on the radio dial. When a human being begs the infinite spirit for money, their underlying vibration is an intense proclamation of their current lack. The universe, acting as a non-judgmental amplifier, simply registers the code of lack and returns the echo of more scarcity into their physical environment. The master, conversely, recognizes that their voice is the law of the fourth dimension. They do not ask the formless substance if it would like to comply. They command it to take form. They speak from the absolute assumption of the finished victory, knowing that the physical world is merely a delayed shadow that has no choice but to align its features with the golden sound wave released by the sovereign throat. The unyielding operation of this vocal sovereignty is beautifully demonstrated through the historical experience of an individual named Ilara. Ilara was a musician of otherworldly capability, a visionary master of resonance who possessed a rare talent for weaving melodies that could alter the psychological state of anyone who heard her play. Her instrument was a magnificent, handcrafted harp carved from the wood of an ancient ash tree. Its strings spun from fine silver wires that could evoke the deep peace of a midnight forest, or the brilliant joy of a summer dawn. Yet, despite her immense creative genius, Ilara's physical life was a continuous, grinding tragedy of survival. She occupied a narrow, freezing attic room at the top of a crooked tenement house, where the winter wind whistled through the loose cracks in the window panes and the snow gathered on her thin blanket. Her clothes were frayed, her shoes were worn thin at the soles, and she relied upon the meager, insulting coins thrown at her feet by half-drunken patrons in the damp taverns of the city's lowest quarters. Ilara responded to this constant stagnation by adopting a specific destructive linguistic crown. Whenever she spoke to her fellow artists, or whenever she looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror of her room, she would repeat a permanent formula of self-definition. I am a starving artist, but at least my work remains pure. She wore the phrase starving artist as if it were a badge of holy honor, entirely unaware that she was using her magnificent voice, the very instrument of vibrational manifestation, to wave a wand of absolute famine over her own fingers. She was commanding the universe to keep her purse empty as a price for her creativity, locking her radio dial into the frequency of deprivation. The transformation began when Ilara encountered the timeless law of the word and realized with a shock of horror that her poverty was not a geographic fact or a decree of fate, but a direct consequence of her own daily songs. She understood that she had been using her golden scepter to cultivate her own wasteland. Ilara made a sovereign decision to completely silence the old report. She entered her cold room, stood before her silver-stringed harp in the silence of the dawn, and initiated a practice of total vibrational realignment. She refused to speak to another human being about her lack, and she refused to describe her cold room to her mind. Every morning, before the noise of the city could pollute her consciousness, Ilara would strike a single, deep, magnificent chord upon the lower strings of her harp, a note so resonant and profound that it mimicked the foundational frequency of the earth itself. As that golden sound wave filled the room, vibrating through her bones, she would project her voice over the music. She did not whisper, nor did she plead. She spoke with the resonant, unhurried authority of a master builder. Infinite Spirit, I give thanks that my music is now a wide open channel for thy great opulence. I command the gold of the universe to flow to my life in exchange for the beauty I release. I am no longer a starving artist. I am a prosperous visionary, and my supply is immediate, permanent, and lavish under grace. At first, her logical intellect mocked her, pointing to her bare cupboard and her frozen fingers, labeling her a liar in the face of physical facts. This was the testing of the word, the moment where the old world attempts to shake the conviction of the master. Ilara remained completely unmoved. When a late notice was slid under her door, she did not wince or contract in fear. She picked up the paper, blessed it as a sovereign dividend, and spoke prosperity over the numbers. She refused to report on the shadow. The manifestation arrived with the suddenness of a lightning bolt. A prominent theatrical director from a distant capital city, an individual who had secretly attended one of her small tavern performances months earlier, reached out to her. He had been haunted for weeks by the unique, resonant quality of her music. He was currently directing a colossal historical cinematic epic for a global syndicate and demanded that Ilara compose the entire musical score for the production. The contract he offered her was of such immense magnitude that its budget exceeded everything she had ever earned in her lifetime combined, accompanied by a permanent royalty structure and an international orchestra to bring her visions to life. Her reality had no choice but to rearrange its atoms. The starving artist had been completely dissolved, and the prosperous visionary had taken the throne through the absolute power of the spoken command. To embody the majestic authority of the sovereign wand within the coordinates of your daily life, you must initiate an immediate and total censorship of your own lips. The practical integration of this truth requires that you treat your throat as a sacred laboratory from which only the currency of gold may be permitted to pass. You must make an unappealable decree to completely cease all reporting on the limitations of your physical landscape. If your bank balance is low, if your business is quiet, or if an unexpected expense arrives, you must absolutely refuse to validate the circumstance with your voice. To speak of lack is to run back to the throne, pick up the scepter, and flash the violet light of destruction across your own fields. When you open your mouth to describe your life from this moment forward, you must speak exclusively from the perspective of the finished victory. You must train your voice to look at the temporary empty spaces of your existence and declare them to be the fertile ground where your abundance is currently condensing into solid form. During the day, when the old habits of worry attempt to capture your tongue, you must instantly anchor your alignment. Silence the negative transmission and reset your internal radio dial to the station of infinite supply, knowing that your word is the absolute law of your environment. As your mind settles into this grand legislative certainty, let the inner self pause for a moment of profound, quiet reflection. As the soul reclaims its golden scepter and learns to speak the language of absolute command, let all residual hesitation vanish from the heart. If this majestic awakening of your voice as an instrument of universal legislation resonates with the deepest chambers of your spirit, take a deliberate moment to anchor this alignment by liking this transmission and subscribing to the sanctuary. Through this conscious act of dedication, you seal your authority over the world of form. The monarch has dried his tears. The old sorrowful descriptions of the wasteland have been silenced forever, and the heavy golden scepter is no longer flashing with the light of destruction. The voice of the master has gone forth into the invisible ether, its magnificent golden sound waves currently tearing down the walls of old limitations, opening ancient vaults that were rusted shut for decades, and forcing the formless substance of the universe to crystallize into the solid structures of wealth and freedom. The path ahead shifts once more, moving away from the high promontory of command and descending toward a great subterranean water wheel that turns slowly in the deep foundations of the estate. The air here changes dramatically, losing the sharp, static electricity of the height and becoming dense with a steady, rhythmic, pulsing current that smells of fresh rain and turning soil. The soul has learned to speak the law, and the blueprints of wealth have been fixed in the invisible. Yet the traveler notices that these beautiful patterns are still floating in a state of suspended animation. The golden words must now be thrown into kinetic, swirling motion through a terrifying and magnificent law of circulation, a system of dynamic giving and receiving that requires the open hand of a sovereign to dissolve the final dams of human retention beckoning the soul into the majestic, rushing revelations of the chapter that lies directly ahead. The exploration of the soul's financial estate descends now into the absolute deepest foundations of the subterranean architecture, arriving at a massive, iron-reinforced vault, hidden beneath the turning gears of a colossal stone water wheel. The space is heavy with the scent of damp slate, ancient minerals, and cold, stagnant air. A solitary shaft of pale amber light filters down from a narrow iron grate in the ceiling, illuminating a human figure sitting upon a pile of unworked stone. This individual is the absolute archetype of financial contraction. His body is bent into a tight, protective knot, his eyes wide and bloodshot with the hyper-vigilance of an absolute survival mindset. In his right hand, the man clutches a single gold coin with such frantic, terrifying intensity that his knuckles have turned a brittle, bloodless white. The sharp, reeded edge of the metal coin has cut deep into the flesh of his palm, causing a thin, dark line of blood to trickle down his wrist and stain the stone beneath his feet. Yet, despite the physical pain, his fingers remain locked in an impenetrable, rigid spasm of retention. He believes with an unshakable, desperate certainty that if he relaxes his grip by even a fraction of a millimeter, if he permits this solitary coin to leave his hand, his entire existence will instantly plunge into ruin and starvation. Now, observe the profound and tragic paradox that defines this subterranean chamber. High above the man's head, through the open iron grate in the ceiling, a continuous, spectacular rain of wealth is pouring down into the vault from the treasuries of the sky. Thousands of beautifully minted gold coins, rare jewels, and heavy silver bars cascade downward through the shadows, striking the air with a clear symphonic ring like 1,000 silver bells. This immense avalanche of abundance is falling directly toward the man's position, ready to bury him in a mountain of effortless security. Yet, because his hands are locked into tight, impenetrable fists of fear, the falling gold cannot be received. The heavy coins strike the smooth, rigid outer surface of his clenched knuckles, bouncing off his hands with a hollow clatter and tumbling uselessly down into the dark, bottomless drainage shafts that border the vault. He stands directly beneath a literal waterfall of infinite wealth, yet he remains starving, bleeding, and destitute because his hands are too tightly closed to catch the treasures being thrown into his lap. To dissolve the ancient psychological dams that freeze the flow of universal wealth within this subterranean vault, one must apply the uncompromising mechanics of recursive inquiry. The wise, invisible observer must look past the immediate symptoms of financial hoarding and ask the foundational questions. Why does the human mind possess an instinctive, desperate compulsion to clutch its remaining currency in moments of economic distress? How does this internal contraction legally bind the soul to the very scarcity it is attempting to ward off? The analytical intellect, operating under the survival directiveness of the beta state, views money as a finite, exhaustible object of material substance. It reasons that if a dollar leaves the hand, that dollar is permanently gone, reducing the individual's total protection against a hostile world. Therefore, when expenses rise or income fluctuates, the logical brain commands an immediate internal contraction. It tightens the purse strings, resents the arrival of invoices, hoards its resources in fear, and views every required expenditure as a violent assault upon its security. This internal contraction, however, triggers a catastrophic metaphysical error. Money is never a static material object. It is condensed spiritual energy, a fluid medium of exchange designed by the infinite intelligence to remain in constant, rhythmic motion. To understand this with absolute clarity, one must explore the fundamental paradigm of human respiration. To live, the physical body must participate in a continuous, unbroken loop of giving and receiving. It must inhale and it must exhale. If an individual, driven by a sudden fear that the atmosphere is running out of oxygen, attempts to take a single deep breath and hold it tightly within their lungs, refusing to exhale out of a desire to conserve their supply, they do not preserve their life, they suffocate. The very air they clutch turns toxic within their chest. Survival is not achieved by retention. It is sustained by the faith that the next breath is already waiting in the atmosphere. When a human being hoards their currency in fear, when they pay their obligations with a bitter scowl of resentment, they are attempting to hold their financial breath. They are creating a massive, energetic dam within the subconscious mind, signaling to the universe that they do not trust the source to provide more. By analyzing this process through the lens of the cosmic mirror, the operational failure becomes entirely transparent. The universe is a non-judgmental reflective glass that can only mirror the exact configuration of the internal self-concept. If the underlying state of the soul is one of tight contraction, fear, and defensive retention, the mirror will continuously project an environment that justifies that contraction. It will deliver broken pipes, sudden liabilities, and stagnant commercial markets that freeze the movement of wealth. The individual has used the radio dial of consciousness to lock their internal receiver directly onto the station of emergency. The external world functions precisely as the echo chamber of that underlying vibration, returning to them the exact acoustic feedback of their own closed hand. The law of divine circulation dictates that the open hand is the only mechanism through which the infinite ocean of opulence can enter the physical life. Whatever is released into the world with an internal song of gratitude and a blessing of love must, by unalterable cosmic law, return to the channel multiplied 1,000-fold. To give is to open the valve for the inflow. When you break the dam of fear, when you pay your bills with a heart of praise and release money with the ease of an exhalation, you are declaring to the subconscious that your supply is infinite, permanent, and independent of any single terrestrial form. The mind steps out from under the artificial scarcity of the ego and aligns itself with the eternal rhythm of the universe, where the hand must become empty for a single second so that it may be filled to overflowing in the next. The absolute, unyielding operation of this kinetic circulation is beautifully demonstrated through the historical narrative of an individual named Soren. Soren was an antiquarian of immense capability, a visionary curator who owned a small, specialized bookshop nestled in a quiet, stone-paved alley of an ancient capital city. His shop was a true sanctuary of human thought, filled from floor to ceiling with rare manuscripts, hand-bound leather volumes, and historical maps that caught the golden light of the afternoon sun. Yet, despite the cultural and spiritual value of his inventory, Soren's commercial life was caught in a state of suffocating stagnation. The bell above his entrance door rarely rang, the shelves gathered thick dust, and the income generated by the shop was a meager, irregular stream that barely sufficed to cover his baseline survival. Soren responded to this financial drought by entering a state of intense psychological contraction. He became a master of the tension of the purse. Every month, when the landlord slid the rent invoice under the heavy oak door, Soren's heart would contract into a tight, bitter knot of rage. He viewed the utility companies, the tax collectors, and his landlord as predatory wolves attempting to steal his remaining crumbs. He would hide the bills in a dark drawer, refusing to look at them until the absolute final warning notice arrived. When he was finally forced to part with his currency, he would clutch the check with trembling fingers, releasing it with a heavy sigh of defeat and a curse upon the cost of existence. He believed he was protecting his business by holding his money until the last possible second, completely unaware that the bitterness of his hand was the very wall freezing the arrival of new customers. The transformation began when Soren encountered the law of circulation and realized that his resentment was acting as a catastrophic block within his own laboratory of manifestation. He understood that every time he cursed his rent invoice, he was literally cursing the roof over his head and commanding his subconscious to dry up his streams of income. Silas made a sovereign decision to initiate a radical practice called the ritual of the blessing. He retrieved every unpaid invoice from the dark drawer and laid them out upon his wooden counter, looking at them not through the eyes of a victim, but through the eyes of a sovereign beneficiary. Soren laid his open hands upon the bills. He did not fight the numbers, nor did he weep over his low bank balance. Instead, he closed his eyes and summoned a deep, genuine feeling of gratitude for the shelter the building had provided his books, the light that allowed him to read, and the warmth of the hearth that protected him from the winter cold. He spoke over the papers with a voice of quiet, total authority. I bless this money as it goes forth to bless the world. I thank the infinite spirit for the space to work and the service provided. This currency now leaves my hand as a seed of light, and it is legally bound by universal law to return to my treasury 1,000-fold under grace and in a perfect way. At first, his logical intellect mocked him, declaring that blessing a piece of paper did not alter the deficit in his account. But Soren remained steadfast, refusing to return to the frequency of emergency. He began to pay his invoices the very morning they arrived, releasing the funds with a genuine smile of joy. He extended the practice to the rare visitors who entered his shop. Even if a person walked the aisles for an hour and departed without purchasing a single book, Soren would bless them silently as they crossed the threshold, thanking them for bringing their energy into his space. The manifestation arrived through a perfect, unpredictable channel that bypassed all conventional commercial expectations. A prominent international archivist from a world-renowned historical society discovered Soren's small catalog through an obscure online forum. The collector flew across the ocean and walked into the shop on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Within an hour of scanning the shelves, the archivist recognized a collection of forgotten, first-edition manuscripts that Soren had acquired decades prior. The collector purchased the entire inventory in a single, massive transaction, wire transferring a sum into Soren's account that sufficed to cover his commercial lease and expenses for an entire consecutive decade. Soren had completely broken the dam of contraction. He had stepped out of the role of a desperate shopkeeper and become a wide-open channel for the magnificent, rushing circulation of the king's gold. To embody the kinetic magic of divine circulation within the coordinates of your daily life, you must initiate an immediate, systematic opening of your hand. The practical integration of this truth requires that you completely alter your emotional relationship with your financial obligations. From this hour forward, when an invoice, a utility bill, or a tax liability reaches your hand, you must absolutely refuse to allow your spirit to contract or wince in fear. You must recognize the document not as a threat to your survival, but as an absolute vessel of flow. You must hold the paper, summon an authentic vibration of gratitude for the service or comfort it represents, and release the funds with the lightness of an exhalation. During the day, when you engage in the acts of commerce, whether you are purchasing basic provisions, paying for transport, or investing in a vision, you must wrap every transaction in the unwavering knowledge of the divine rebate. The internal radio dial must be firmly guarded against the station of hoarding. You must state to your subconscious as the money leaves your palm, "I release you with love, seed of gold, for the infinite source is standing right behind me, and the valve for the inflow is now flung wide open." As you cultivate this grand, uncontracted state of being, let us utilize the power of the midnight decree. If you should find yourself awake in the deep silence of the night, do not use those hours to build a monument to your debts or count the days until the next calculation of survival. Instead, speak directly to the darkness, letting your voice activate the sensitive plate of the fourth dimension. Whisper into the room with total serene authority, "Money flows to me now. My supply is immediate. I am a match for the gold of the king." Repeat this until the words become a physical vibration that lulls your consciousness back into the arms of the infinite. As your mind stabilizes within this grand, circulating certainty, let the inner self pause for a moment of profound, quiet reflection. As the soul throws open its hands and enters the magnificent swirling rhythm of universal giving and receiving, let all remaining tension leave the solar plexus. If this kinetic awakening of your open hand as an instrument of infinite circulation resonates with the deepest chambers of your spirit, take a deliberate moment to anchor this alignment by liking this transmission and subscribing to the sanctuary. Through this conscious act, you ensure these eternal laws continue to flood your life with abundance. The merchant in the vault has finally let go of the single coin. The iron spasm of his hand has dissolved into a wide, open palm, and the thin line of blood has been washed away by a sudden warm stream of golden light. He is no longer defensive. His knuckles are no longer rigid rocks blocking the current. He stands with his head held high and his hands turned upward to the sky, easily catching the magnificent symphonic avalanche of coins that pours down through the ceiling grate. The path ahead opens once more, leading away from the subterranean water wheel and ascending a spiral staircase of white stone that cuts through the mountain rock. As the traveler climbs, the heavy, dense atmosphere of physical friction begins to evaporate entirely. The sound of the water wheel fades into a vast, absolute silence that feels thick, pregnant, and utterly otherworldly. The traveler has learned to circulate the material forms of wealth, yet they are about to enter a realm where form itself dissolves into pure potentiality. The staircase terminates at a heavy crystalline veil that separates the three-dimensional world of human perception from the majestic coordinates of the fourth dimension. Behind this veil lies the sacred sanctuary of sensory alchemy, the place where the physical eyes must go blind so that the spiritual sight, hearing, and touch can learn to freeze the very atmosphere into gold. The narrative leaves the seeker standing at this breathtaking, silent threshold where the world of form must be abandoned to claim the substance itself, beckoning the soul into the majestic, dimension-shattering revelations of the chapter that lies directly ahead. The ascent through the inner architecture of the mind arrives at a boundary that defies the traditional parameters of human geometry. The traveler has climbed the spiral staircase of white stone, leaving behind the heavy kinetic currents of the subterranean water wheel, and now stands before a colossal, shimmering veil of pure crystalline light. This veil does not separate one physical room from another. It marks the absolute border between the three-dimensional world of human perception and the majestic, shoreless coordinates of the fourth dimension. The air here is completely devoid of density, vibrating with a silent, pregnant weight that feels utterly otherworldly. It is a space where time does not pass, but rather hovers in a continuous state of the eternal present, waiting for the command of the Master. Past this crystalline veil lies a magnificent vault of immense cavernous proportions, constructed from blocks of translucent alabaster that glow with an internal violet luminescence. Inside this sanctuary stands a tragic figure, providing a profound and terrifying paradox for the invisible observer to witness. The vault is not empty. It is filled to the absolute ceiling, with the most spectacular display of wealth imaginable. Colossal chests of ancient cedar overflow with thousands of beautifully minted gold coins. Mounds of uncut emeralds and sapphires cascade down the walls like rivers of frozen light, and heavy tapestries woven from fine golden thread hang from the arches, warming the air with the rich radiation of absolute opulence. The treasure is so dense that it presses against the very atmosphere, vibrating with a high, clear resonance that sounds like 1,000 silver harps. Yet the man standing in the center of this mountain of gold is weeping in absolute, agonizing despair. His eyes are wide, but they are glazed over with the thick cataracts of an exclusive physical focus. He reaches out his trembling, raw hands into the space directly before his face. His fingers pass straight through a massive pile of golden bullion, grazing only the cool, empty air of the room. Because his nerve endings do not immediately fire with the tactile signal of solid matter, because his ears can only detect the hollow silence of the physical chamber, and because his physical eyes can only see the gray reflection of his own internal doubts, he collapses to the stone floor. He beats his fists against the ground, crying out into the stillness that he is starving, that he is destitute, and that the universe has abandoned him to a desert of permanent poverty. He is completely enveloped by an absolute fortune of infinite supply, yet he remains a miserable beggar, because his physical senses can only report on the hollow shadow of the world, leaving him entirely blind to the magnificent substance that is currently brushing against his skin. To pierce the tragic illusion that keeps the human soul starving within the very treasury of the king, one must initiate a rigorous philosophical and psychological deconstruction of human perception, utilizing the uncompromising method of recursive thinking. The wise observer must look beneath the mechanics of biology and ask the foundational questions. Why does the human creature grant absolute sovereign authority to the reports of the 5 physical senses when those senses are consistently exposed as late-stage deceptions? How does the stabilization of the internal sensorium manage to freeze the formless energy of the 4th dimension into the solid bricks of material wealth? The answer to this query requires a profound investigation into the relationship between human biology and metaphysical truth. The conscious intellect, operating on the noisy front porch of the beta brainwave state, is evolutionary hardwired to treat the physical environment as the primary cause of reality. It looks at the small balance on a digital screen, hears the rumor of a market contraction, feels the thin texture of an empty wallet, and immediately registers an absolute emergency. The analytical brain reasons that if the physical hand cannot grasp the gold does not exist. This reliance upon the flesh, however, is a catastrophic reversal of reality. The three-dimensional world is never a primary source. It is a delayed reflection, an acoustic feedback loop, a dead shadow of a much grander, more permanent architecture that operates within the fourth dimension of pure spirit. To understand this dynamic with absolute clarity, one must re-examine the foundational metaphor of the mirror. If an individual stands before a physical mirror and observes a countenance of exhaustion and poverty reflected within the glass, they do not attempt to alter the surface of the mirror to fix the image. They understand that the mirror is entirely helpless, lacking any independent volitional power or underlying substance. It can only reflect the state of the object standing before it. Yet, in the theater of financial survival, humanity spends its entire existence attempting to manually reshape the mirror of the physical world through the frantic, muscular friction of the hustle, while leaving the internal sensory blueprint of poverty completely intact. This brings the recursive deconstruction to the mechanics of the radio dial. The universe is not a collection of scarce, isolated objects. It is a continuous, shoreless ocean of formless energy, vibrating at every conceivable frequency simultaneously. The frequency of absolute luxury and the frequency of desperate starvation exist in the exact same spatial coordinate at the exact same moment. They are entirely independent realities. When you allow your physical senses to dictate your internal state, when you report on the emptiness of your pockets and permit your mind to wince in fear at a price tag, you have used your attention to lock your internal radio dial onto the station of famine. The external world merely functions as the echo chamber of that underlying sensory broadcast, returning to you the precise physical materialization of your own internal blindness. To break this cycle of deception, the traveler must master the mystical art of sensory alchemy, the systematic training of the internal spiritual sight, spiritual hearing, and spiritual touch to register the absolute reality of wealth in the invisible atmosphere before it ever touches the physical earth. This is the understanding that the fourth dimension is not a distant realm to be reached after death, but the underlying substance of the very room in which you sit. Money is not a rigid piece of paper or a metal coin. It is condensed spirit, a temporary condensation of an invisible, infinite energy that surrounds you like oxygen. When you look past the physical shadow of lack, when you consciously stabilize your internal eye to see the gold in the atmosphere, your internal ear to hear the sound of the harvest, and your internal skin to feel the weight of the sovereign scepter, you are rewriting the code of your reality. You are creating a powerful magnetic coordinate within the subconscious workshop. The physical world, being a helpless mirror, is legally bound by universal law to alter its features, forcing the formless substance to freeze into solid form to match the golden sound wave released by the master's mind. The absolute, unyielding operation of this sensory alchemy is beautifully demonstrated through the historical experience of an individual named Mara. Mara was the caretaker and hereditary steward of an ancient, sprawling family estate known as the Manor of Oakhaven, a property of immense historical significance, defined by towering stone columns, vast libraries of forgotten knowledge, and a legacy of grace that had, over consecutive decades of neglect, fallen into deep disrepair. The gardens where children had once played were completely choked by jagged, thick thorns. The slate roof let in the weeping winter rains, staining the ancient ceilings, and the municipal taxes on the land had not been paid in many years, accumulating a mountain of legal liabilities that threatened to destroy the heritage forever. Mara lived within the cold rooms of this decaying manor in a state of constant grinding terror. Every morning, when the post arrived, her heart would contract into a tight knot of panic, fearing that the final eviction notice had arrived, the unappealable decree that the massive iron gates of her ancestry would be locked and the estate lost to the winds of debt forever. Her physical senses reported nothing but total, imminent ruin. She saw the dust motes dancing in the freezing gray light of the empty corridors. She smelled the damp rot of the cellar rising through the floorboards, and she heard only the hollow, ominous silence of a house that was dying under the weight of financial starvation. Her analytical logic declared that the situation was entirely hopeless, reasoning that a solitary individual with no visible stream of income could not possibly rescue a crumbling palace from the gears of a hostile economic system. The transformation began when Mara encountered the law of the word and realized with a shock of revelation that she was using her physical senses to cultivate her own prison. She understood that by continuously focusing on the dust, the rot, and the silence, She was commanding her subconscious mind to freeze that ruin into a permanent physical fact. Mara made a sovereign decision to completely reject the report of her eyes and ears. She entered the grandest, coldest reception hall of the estate, closed her eyes to the physical environment, and initiated a radical practice of sensory substitution. She refused to report on the shadow of decay, choosing instead to tune her internal radio dial to the frequency of the finished victory. Every afternoon, Mara would walk slowly through the empty, freezing corridors, performing a secret ritual of the spirit. She would reach out her physical hand and touch a peeling, damp wall covered in mold. But in the secret laboratory of her imagination, she refused to register the cold moisture. She stabilized her internal skin until she could vividly feel the cool, smooth, rich texture of fine silk wallpaper lining the corridor. When she walked through the overgrown courtyard, instead of seeing the gray, tangled mess of the thorns, her internal eye was locked onto the vivid, defiant crimson of a prize-winning rose garden in full summer bloom. Most importantly, Mara practiced the art of spiritual hearing. Every evening before sleep, as she lay in the dark, instead of listening to the melancholy wind whistling through the cracks in the window panes, she would force her internal ears to hear two distinct, finished sounds: the firm, rhythmic scratch of a heavy fountain pen, signing a legal document, the sound of her taxes being paid in full, and the crisp, clear splash of the courtyard fountain being turned back on, its water dancing in the sunlight. She fell asleep night after night, enveloped in the sensory reality of the restoration, treating the invisible as her only true material. For 7 consecutive months, the physical world mocked her efforts. A city lawyer called her with a voice of stone, warning her that the timeline was running out and that the auction of the property was imminent. But Mara remained completely non-resistant, refusing to grant the shadow the power to cause a single tremor of fear. She stated to the darkness, "I do not recognize that report. I have already heard the sound of my freedom, and my supply is logically provided for by the infinite spirit." The manifestation arrived through a perfect, magnificent channel that no human intellect could have planned with a millennium of linear thinking. A global historical preservation society, funded by an extravagant estate in a distant capital, discovered an ancient set of journals belonging to a famous early explorer who had once hidden his primary cartographical records within the hollow insulation of Oakhaven's stone walls. The society reached out to Mara, offering her a massive, permanent federal grant to completely restore the manor-turned international research center, accompanied by a lavish lifetime salary as the absolute director of the sanctuary. The workers paid by the spirit cleared the thorns, the roof was mended with fine slate, and the courtyard fountain was turned back on, its water splashing with the exact rhythmic cadence Mara had heard in the silence of her dark bedroom. She had fixed the blueprint in the 4th dimension, and the physical mirror had no choice but to project the image into the sun. To embody the majestic power of sensory alchemy within the coordinates of your daily life, you must initiate an immediate, systematic mutiny against your physical senses. The practical integration of this truth requires that you completely cease looking for your wealth in the physical world tomorrow. You must understand that if you wait for the money to arrive in your bank account before you allow yourself to feel the ease and the poise of a wealthy person, you are remaining a helpless slave to the reflection in the mirror. You must reverse the process. You must establish the sensory reality of your abundance within the secret chambers of your consciousness now, and allow the physical world to catch up with your sound wave. Tonight, as you prepare to descend into the final layers of this transformative night, perform your own act of sensory substitution. Before you allow sleep to claim your body, close your eyes to the physical room and enter the sanctuary of the 4th dimension. I want you to actively hear your supply. Force your internal ears to listen to the clear, bright chime of the notification on your digital device that tells you a massive, life-altering deposit has been made into your account. Hear the calm, steady voice of a person you respect looking at you and saying, "I am so profoundly moved by your incredible success." Reach out your internal hand and feel the texture of your luxury, the crisp crinkle of fresh bills, or the smooth wood of a grand desk of command. These sensations are real within the fourth dimension, and because they are established there, they are even now forcing the atoms of your waking reality to crystallize into matching forms. As your mind stabilizes within this grand multidimensional certainty, let the inner self pause for a moment of profound, quiet reflection. As the soul masters the coordinates of the fourth dimension and learns to feel the substance of wealth in the invisible, let all residual doubt dissolve into the great silence. If this sensory awakening of your spiritual sight, hearing, and touch resonates with the deepest chambers of your spirit, take a deliberate moment to anchor this alignment by liking this transmission and subscribing to the sanctuary. Through this conscious act of devotion, you lock your internal receiver into the frequency of infinite overflow. The traveler has crossed the crystalline veil. The old cataracts of exclusive physical focus have fallen away from your eyes, and the illusion of the empty room has been shattered forever by the light of the truth. You are no longer a blind inhabitant of a scarce world, weeping over phantoms of lack. You stand with your head held high in the absolute center of the king's treasury, your internal senses fully awake, your spirit completely integrated with the vibrant, golden substance of infinite supply. The midnight hour is nearly complete, and the deep watch of the night begins to tilt slowly toward the eastern horizon. The air within the alabaster chamber changes once more, losing the thick, static silence of the deep dimension and becoming light, crisp, and vibrant with the first faint currents of an impending dawn. The identity has been rewritten, the ledger has been cleansed, and the sensory coordinates of wealth have been fixed in the invisible fabric of the cosmos. Yet the traveler observes that the physical body is now beginning to stir, preparing to wake from its long pilgrimage through the night. The golden blueprints have been laid, but they must now be anchored into the concrete reality of the waking day. The narrative leaves the seeker poised at this fragile, monumental threshold, where the transition from sleep to life requires the ultimate coronation of the soul, the immediate activation of the morning ritual that seals the minted gold into the physical earth, beckoning the traveler into the final, sovereign, world-shaping triumphs of the chapter that lies directly ahead. The deep watch of midnight begins to tilt slowly toward the eastern horizon, and the absolute stillness of the inner dimensions starts to feel the first fragile tremors of a physical awakening. The violet luminescence of the alchemical chamber and the sapphire currents of the shoreless ocean recede into the deep background of the subconscious, leaving the traveler suspended within a delicate, liminal threshold, the twilight state of the dawn. In this highly sensitive window, the physical body stirs beneath the weight of the linens. The breathing, which had been deep, rhythmic, and synchronized with the opulence of the cosmos for hours, shifts to a lighter, shallow cadence. The eyes flutter behind closed lids, as the neural architecture of the brain prepares to leave the profound sanctuaries of theta and delta to reclaim its position in the waking world. Now, observe the spectacular and perilous paradox that defines this exact micro-moment of transformation. As the conscious intellect reclaims its guard post on the front porch of existence, a silent, aggressive ambush is initiated. The old habits of the terrestrial self, the historical memories of debt, the conditioned calculations of scarcity, and the heavy anxieties of the daily struggle gather at the edge of the mind like a flock of predatory scavenging birds. They hover in the gray light of the early morning, waiting for the precise second the traveler opens their physical eyes to descend upon the consciousness. The immediate temptation for the waking individual is to default instantly to their ancient report, to reach out a hand and grasp the cold plastic of a digital device, to check the notifications of a volatile marketplace, or to let out a heavy, habitual sigh over the impending expenses of the day. This liminal threshold is the ultimate battleground for the preservation of the gold. The traveler has spent the night clearing ledgers, dissolving the leaden mask of history, and claiming the boundless treasury of the infinite source. Yet, all of that magnificent internal alchemy stands in a state of extreme vulnerability. The morning transition is the precise hinge upon which the entire structure of reality swings. If the master falters in this fragile window, if they permit the scavenging birds of memory to capture their first attention, they are like a builder who spends the night raising a magnificent palace of gold, only to violently tear it down with their own hands at the arrival of the sun. To understand why the waking mind defaults to its ancient chains with such instinctive velocity upon opening its eyes, And to master the structural mechanics required to anchor the inner gold into the physical earth, one must apply the uncompromising edge of recursive thinking. The wise, invisible observer must look past the biological routine of the morning and ask the foundational queries. Why does the human consciousness experience its greatest spiritual vulnerability at the exact moment of physical awakening? How does the first deliberate configuration of attention determine the geometric parameters of the entire material day through the immutable laws of reality? The answer to this recursive inquiry requires a rigorous examination of the transition between brainwave frequencies. During the hours of deep sleep, the analytical intellect is entirely incapacitated. The critical century is asleep, and the soul is bathed directly in the unformed opulent substance of the fourth dimension. However, as the body transitions into the waking state, it must pass through the highly plastic frequency of alpha before entering the high-velocity friction of the beta state. In this hypnopompia phase, the mind is a perfectly exposed photographic plate. It is completely receptive, lacking any defensive barriers against suggestion. Why, then, does the mind naturally choose to expose this pristine plate to the images of its past limitations? Because the human ego possesses an addictive loyalty to the familiar geometry of its historical struggle. It mistakes the predictable pattern of its worries for absolute safety. When an individual wakes and immediately allows their mind to report on their tiredness, or when they wince at the recollection of an outstanding debt, they are performing a catastrophic metaphysical reset. They are taking the pristine white canvas of a new day and immediately painting it with the gray ash of yesterday's famine. By exploring this process through the core metaphors of our architecture, the structural failure becomes entirely transparent. The universe operates as an absolute, non-judgmental mirror. It cannot project an environment of effortless commercial abundance, while the individual standing before it insists on wearing the facial lineaments of a financial victim. When you check your accounts with a trembling heart first thing in the morning, you have manually seized the radio dial of your consciousness and locked the receiver into the station of emergency. The universe, functioning as an infinite amplifier, has no choice but to honor that broadcast frequency. It ensures that every conversation, every transaction, and every contract encountered during the subsequent 12 hours becomes a flawless, terrifying echo of that initial morning contraction. The morning ritual, therefore, must be understood not as a casual practice of self-help, but as the secure, impenetrable vault that protects the wealth consciousness minted during the night. To anchor the gold into the physical earth, the master must initiate an immediate, absolute mutiny against the reports of the five senses in the first 5 minutes of the day. You must realize that the small balance in the account, or the challenges in the marketplace, are not active causes. They are merely the dead shadows of your old dissolved vocabulary. They have no independent life or volitional power to sustain themselves unless you grant them your precious focus. The master does not wait for the physical check to arrive before assuming the poise of an opulent being. They understand that the internal assumption of wealth is the absolute cause that forces the physical check to manifest. By structuring the first thoughts of the morning with the quiet authority of a sovereign legislator, the internal radio dial is permanently welded to the frequency of absolute supply, forcing the physical mirror of the world to align its features with the golden blueprint of the soul. The absolute, unyielding operation of this morning anchoring is beautifully demonstrated through the historical experience of an individual named Jordan. Jordan was an enterprise developer of immense strategic capability, a visionary architect of commercial platforms who possessed a rare talent for identifying highly lucrative market inefficiencies. Yet, for an entire consecutive decade, Jordan lived in a state of profound financial contraction and anxiety. Despite his brilliant ideas and his relentless execution of 18-hour workdays, his firm was caught in a permanent bottleneck. Cash flow was an erratic, suffocating trickle. High-value clients would walk away at the absolute last moment of negotiation, and Jordan found himself constantly borrowing funds to settle his baseline commercial liabilities. The true cause of this persistent stagnation was not located in the terrestrial economy, but upon the mattress of Jordan's bedroom. For 10 years, Jordan had been a psychological slave to the trance of the morning worry. Every single morning, the moment his eyes fluttered open to encounter the gray light filtering through his window, a heavy, suffocating sensation would instantly descend upon his chest. His mind would automatically launch into a frantic, defensive calculation of his liabilities. How much is remaining in the operational vault? How will I clear the upcoming payroll? Why must every dollar be won through such exhausting combat? Before Jordan had even lifted his head from the pillow, before his feet had touched the floor, he had already used the scepter of his voice to decree a new day of absolute lack. He was locking his radio dial onto the station of famine before entering the world, ensuring that his entire day became a brutal echo of those first 5 minutes of panic. The transformation began when Jordan encountered the law of the word, and realized with a shock of clarity that he was systematically tearing down his own empire at the arrival of every dawn. He understood that if he desired a new financial reality, he had to become the absolute master of his morning. Jordan made a sovereign covenant with his future self to completely re-engineer the first 5 minutes of his day, treating that window as a sacred sanctuary that no terrestrial report could be permitted to pollute. On the subsequent Monday morning, as his eyes opened to the gray light, the ancient scavenging birds of memory swooped down to capture his attention, attempting to remind him of an overdue invoice. Jordan refused to engage. He froze the frame of his mind. Before he checked his digital device, before he permitted a single calculation of survival to enter his intellect, and before he rose from his bed, Jordan sat up straight. He took a deep, magnificent breath of the infinite substance, expanding his chest, and spoke his morning decree into the quiet room with a voice of calm, total authority. I awake this day as a wealthy person. During the night, while my body rested, the spirit that never slumbers has completely dissolved every block to my prosperity and installed the perfect divine design for my success. I am not a person hoping for wealth. I am the living embodiment of wealth itself. I thank the infinite source for this day of finished victory, and I command the manifest gold of the universe to flow into my life through expected and unexpected channels under grace and in a perfect way. At first, his logical intellect mocked his effort, pointing to his empty fridge and his stagnant accounts, screaming that he was a liar, speaking empty words to an indifferent room. This was the testing of his faith. Jordan remained completely non-resistant, refusing to grant the shadow the power to cause an internal contraction. By the second week of maintaining this ritual, the heavy weight upon his chest had completely vanished, replaced by a strange, bubbling sensation of absolute expectation. On the 10th morning of his practice, while speaking the decree, a sudden, brilliant, intuitive lead flashed through his consciousness, a completely unique design for a simplified service network that his target community had been desperately requiring for years. Jordan rose and executed that inspired action that very afternoon with the relaxed, unhurried poise of a sovereign ruler. Within 30 days of initiating the morning reset, his firm secured 3 consecutive global retainers that completely cleared his liabilities and tripled his monthly operational revenue, permanently breaking the bottleneck of his existence. Jordan had not altered his work ethic. He had simply become the master of his morning, forcing the physical mirror of reality to reflect the golden standard of his first conscious breath. To embody the absolute authority of the awakened master and anchor the gold of this entire pilgrimage into the concrete reality of your waking existence, you must initiate an immediate, unappealable coronation of your morning hours. The practical integration of this truth requires that you treat the first 5 minutes after your physical eyes open as the absolute vault of your destiny. You must establish a rigid, sacred perimeter around your consciousness in this window. Before you permit the digital currency of the outer world to enter your mind, and before you allow your intellect to perform a single calculation of survival, you must sit up, take a deep breath of the infinite atmosphere, and execute your morning decree with the absolute resonance of a sovereign legislator. As you step out of your bed and move through the rooms of your home, you must walk with the precise poise, the stride, and the ease of an individual who possesses an unlimited account in the bank of the cosmos. You must refuse to let your eyes deceive you. If the physical mirror of your circumstances displays a temporary delay or a challenge in your commercial affairs, you must look directly through the phantom and say to the appearance with a calm, royal smile, I salute the infinite gold that is currently condensing through you. You are not a limitation, you are a seed, and my harvest is already manifest in the sun. Treat every encounter, every bill, and every transaction as a divine appointment structured by the king to deliver your permanent dividend. The pilgrimage through the 10 chapters of the inner estate has reached its grand, magnificent completion. The personal context of your creative vision, the universal laws of Florence Scovel Shinn, and the deep brainwave frequencies of the subconscious mind have been completely synthesized into one single, unbroken realization. You have walked through the galleries of the mind, cleared the ancient red ink from the ledgers of time, dissolved the leaden mask of hereditary restriction, claimed the shoreless ocean of supply, wielded the sovereign wand of vocal command, and thrown your wealth into kinetic motion through the open hand of circulation. The traveler stands now upon the high, open balcony of their inner mansion, looking out over a magnificent landscape that has been entirely transformed by the light of the truth. The sun has risen fully over the horizon, turning every desert into a fertile garden, every wall into an open door, and every shadow into pure liquid gold. The invisible has become the substance has become the form, and the entire architecture of existence has been locked into the eternal, silent frequency of the finished victory. There are no more equations to solve, no more phantoms to fight, and no more borders to cross. The law cannot be mocked. The harvest is a mathematical certainty, and the sovereign master has finally come home to rest in the peace of the opulent, now and forevermore. It is finished, it is done, it is so.